Power doesn't announce itself with trumpets. It walks into rooms and everyone else stops breathing. Duke Caedric Ashbourne understood this the way other men understood hunger. At 34, he'd built an empire from the wreckage of his father's weakness, transforming the Ashbourne name from a cautionary tale into something whispered with fear across London's political corridors. He collected debts like other men collected stamps. He dismantled rivals the way surgeons remove tumors, precisely, without sentiment, leaving no trace of hesitation. Tonight, that empire was burning. The ballroom at Whitmore Hall blazed with enough candlelight to illuminate the faces of England's most powerful families, all of them gathered to watch him bleed. Caedric stood near the marble columns at the room's edge, a glass of whiskey in his hand that he hadn't touched in 20 minutes. His dark coat fit like armor. His expression revealed nothing. But everyone in that room knew what was coming. Lord Edmund Hartley stood at the center of the crowd, silver-haired and smiling with the confidence of a man who'd finally found the blade sharp enough to gut a duke. Beside him, Lady Seraphina Everleigh, Caedric's former fiancée, wore emerald silk and a smile cold enough to freeze blood. 3 months ago, Caedric had broken their engagement in front of half of Parliament. Tonight, they were destroying him for it. What happens when the most dangerous man in England finally makes a mistake? When power built on fear discovers that fear has limits? Stay with me, because tonight, you're going to watch an empire crack open, and what crawls out of the wreckage isn't what anyone expected, not even the Duke himself. Sex. Hartley's voice cut through the chamber's ambient noise like a knife through silk. Ladies and gentlemen, if I might have your attention. The crowd shifted, conversations died. Caedric remained motionless, his back to the column, his gaze fixed on Hartley with the kind of focus a wolf gives a deer just before the chase. We gather tonight to celebrate tradition, Hartley continued, his tone rich with false warmth. The bonds that unite our great families, the honor that sustains our realm. Caedric's jaw tightened fractionally. Hartley smiled wider. Which is why it pains me to address a matter that threatens those very foundations. Duke Ashbourne, would you join us? Every eye in the ballroom turned toward Caedric. He didn't move immediately. Let them wait. Let them wonder if he'd refuse, if he'd walk out, if he'd do anything other than exactly what they expected. Then he pushed off from the column and crossed the floor with the unhurried confidence of a man who'd survived worse than public humiliation. The crowd parted for him like water around a blade. He stopped 3 feet from Hartley, close enough to see the satisfaction burning behind the older man's diplomatic expression. You have something to say, Edmund? Caedric's voice was quiet, controlled, lethal. Not to say, Your Grace. To show. Hartley gestured to a servant, who stepped forward carrying a leather portfolio. Documents recently brought to my attention. Financial records from Ashbourne Holdings. Specifically, records pertaining to investments in the Northern Rail Company. Caedric's expression didn't change, but something flickered behind his eyes. Brief, dark. Hartley opened the portfolio with theatrical precision. These documents prove that you, Duke Ashbourne, manipulated share prices through insider information obtained from parliamentary committees. You profited while honest investors lost fortunes. Worse, you used those profits to expand your political influence, buying loyalty and crushing opposition. The ballroom erupted in gasps and whispers. Caedric stood silent. Furthermore, Hartley continued, his voice rising, these records show payments to several members of Parliament. Bribes, Your Grace. A systematic corruption of the very institutions we're sworn to protect. Seraphina stepped forward, her green eyes gleaming with vindication. You broke our engagement because I refused to be party to your schemes, she said, her voice carrying across the room. You called me weak. You called me sentimental, but I was simply unwilling to participate in treason. The word hung in the air like smoke from a gun. Treason. Caedric looked at her for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was soft enough that half the room leaned forward to hear. Treason. That's a heavy accusation, Seraphina, particularly from someone who spent 2 years enjoying the benefits of my supposed corruption without complaint. Her cheeks flushed. I didn't know. You knew. He cut her off with the precision of a scalpel. You knew every time you wore diamonds I bought with those profits. You knew every time you attended balls funded by those investments. You knew, and you didn't care until I had the audacity to choose someone else. The room went dead silent. Serafina's composure cracked. You chose a nobody, a girl whose father was a traitor? Careful. The single word from Caedric carried enough menace to stop her mid-sentence. Speak about Evelyn again, and discover exactly how ruthless I can be when provoked. Hartley stepped between them, his expression hardening. Your threats mean nothing now, Ashbourne. These documents are genuine. The evidence is overwhelming. By morning, warrants will be issued. Your assets will be frozen. Your titles will be reviewed by the Crown. Your empire, he smiled, ends tonight. Caedric turned his gaze to Hartley with the slow deliberation of a predator sizing up prey. You think you've won? I know I have. Then you're a fool. Caedric's voice dropped lower, colder. You're holding forged documents, Edmund. Decent forgeries, I'll grant you. Someone talented created them. But forgeries nonetheless. Hartley's smile wavered. That's absurd. The Northern Rail transactions you referenced. They occurred through a shell company registered in my name, except I dissolved that company 8 months ago and transferred all holdings to a trust managed by independent solicitors. Every transaction since then has been conducted under their authority, not mine. Public records will confirm this, records that predate your supposed evidence by half a year. The color drained from Hartley's face. Caedric continued, his tone conversational now, almost pleasant. The payments to Parliament members? Those were charitable donations made through the Ashbourne Foundation, fully documented, fully legal. Each recipient will testify to that under oath. And they will testify, Edmund, because every one of them owes me favors worth more than whatever you promised them to stay quiet tonight. Serafina stepped forward. You're lying. I'm stating facts. Caedric pulled a folded paper from his inner coat pocket and handed it to Hartley. That's a letter from the Crown's chief investigator confirming that my holdings have been under voluntary audit for the past 6 months. Everything you've accused me of? Already investigated. Already cleared. Hartley stared at the letter, his hands trembling. So here's what actually happens next, Caedric said quietly. You'll apologize, publicly, tonight. You'll admit this was a mistake based on fraudulent information. Then you'll spend the rest of your miserable existence praying I don't decide to destroy you the way I've destroyed better men for lesser offenses. The ballroom had gone so quiet that the crackle of candles sounded like gunfire. Hartley's throat worked. I was misled. You were greedy. Caedric's voice hardened. You saw an opportunity to claim my territory and you seized it without thinking, without planning, without understanding that men like me don't leave vulnerabilities exposed. He turned to face the crowd, his gaze sweeping across the assembled nobility like a blade. Let this be a lesson. Power isn't about titles. It isn't about money. It's about knowing every knife before it reaches your back and making sure the person holding it understands exactly what it will cost them to strike. Then he looked at Serafina. As for you, our engagement is over. Our association is over. If you speak Eveline's name in public again, I will ensure every family in England knows exactly why I ended our betrothal. The gambling debts your brother hid, the affair your mother conducted with Lord Pemberton, the fact that your family's fortune exists, only because I chose not to collect on loans your father took from Ashbourne banks. Serafina went white. Test me, Caedric said softly, and find out how merciful I'm feeling. He turned and walked toward the ballroom doors. No one stopped him. No one spoke. The Duke of Ashbourne had just survived a public execution and turned it into a massacre. The carriage ride back to Ashbourne House took 40 minutes through London's rain-slicked streets. Caedric sat in silence, watching water stream down the windows while his driver navigated the late-night traffic. His hands rested on his knees, relaxed, steady. Inside his mind was a blade being sharpened. Hartley's attempt had been crude, desperate, doomed from the start, but it was a symptom of something larger, something more dangerous. The moment Caedric had broken his engagement to Serafina and taken Evelyn under his protection, he declared war on half of England's aristocracy. They thought he'd done it out of obsession. They were right. But obsession, Caedric had learned, was just another word for focus when applied correctly. The carriage stopped outside Ashbourne House, a Georgian mansion that occupied an entire block in Mayfair. Caedric climbed out without waiting for his driver and strode through the rain to the front entrance. The door opened before he reached it. His butler, Matthias, waiting with a towel and that expression of careful neutrality that servants perfected after decades of service. Your Grace, Miss Marrow is waiting in the library. Caedric took the towel, dried his face, and handed it back. How long? 2 hours. She refused dinner. Of course she did. Caedric removed his coat and started toward the library. Any other visitors? Lord Pemberton called. I told him you were indisposed. Good. If he calls again, tell him I'm dead. Very good, sir. Caedric pushed open the library doors and found Evelyn exactly where he expected, curled in the leather chair by the fireplace, a book open in her lap that she clearly wasn't reading. She looked up when he entered, her dark eyes assessing him with the kind of sharp intelligence that had first caught his attention 6 months ago. She wore a simple gray dress. No jewelry. Her dark hair was pulled back in a practical bun. She looked nothing like the jeweled peacocks who'd filled Whitmore Hall tonight, and that was precisely why Caedric found her more captivating than any of them. You survived, she said. Did you doubt I would? No. She closed the book. But I wondered what it would cost you. Caedric crossed to the sideboard and poured himself whiskey. Real whiskey this time, not the prop he'd carried at the ball. He downed it in one swallow, felt the burn, poured another. Nothing I couldn't afford. You're lying. He turned to look at her. What makes you say that? Because you're drinking like a man trying to drown something. Evelyn stood, setting the book aside. What happened? Caedric studied her face. Most people couldn't read him. Years of practice had turned his expressions into masks, his words into calculated weapons. But Evelyn had a way of cutting through all of it, of seeing past the armor to the bleeding wounds underneath. It was terrifying. It was addictive. Hartley accused me of treason, he said flatly. Presented forged documents in front of half of Parliament. Serafina backed his play. They wanted me destroyed. Evelyn's expression hardened. But you weren't. No. Because you'd already prepared for it. I prepare for everything. He took another drink. Hartley's mistake was assuming I wouldn't see betrayal coming. I've been seeing it my entire life. She crossed the room toward him, stopping a few feet away. Close enough that he could smell the lavender soap she used. Far enough that he couldn't reach for her without making it a choice. This is because of me, she said quietly. Don't flatter yourself. Don't lie to me. Her voice sharpened. You broke your engagement for me. You brought me here despite knowing it would make you vulnerable. You've spent 6 months protecting me from people who want the evidence I carry about my father's murder. All of that gave Hartley an opening. Hartley gave himself an opening by being ambitious and stupid. Caedric set down his glass with controlled precision. You didn't force me to do anything, Evelyn. I made choices. I'll deal with the consequences. Why? The question hung between them like a blade. Caedric could have deflected, could have turned it into something cold and tactical, could have explained how her evidence against the men who'd framed her father as a traitor gave him leverage over some of the most powerful families in England. Instead, he told the truth. Because the first time I saw you walk into that ballroom 6 months ago, carrying proof that could topple ministers and knowing it could get you killed, I realized you had something I'd spent my entire life trying to build. What's that? The ability to stand alone in a room full of predators and not flinch. Evelyn's breath caught. Caedric stepped closer, close enough now that he could see the firelight reflecting in her eyes, could count the rapid pulse at her throat. You asked what tonight cost me, he said quietly. The truth? Nothing. Because watching Hartley realize he'd walked into a trap reminded me why I'm still alive when better men are buried. I don't leave vulnerabilities exposed. I don't make moves without knowing the board. And I sure as hell don't start wars I'm not prepared to win. Then why do I feel like you're fighting a losing battle? The question hit harder than Hartley's accusations. Because she was right. Caedric had spent 6 months defending Evelyn from enemies who wanted her silenced. He'd burned alliances, spent fortunes, made himself a target. And for what? For the slim chance that exposing the conspiracy around her father's death would somehow matter in a world where power always protected itself? No. For the even slimmer chance that someone might exist in this world who understood him without needing to be convinced that he was worth understanding. You think I'm losing? He asked softly. I think you're fighting a war on too many fronts. Hartley tonight. Serafina and her allies. The ministers who want my evidence buried. Your own conscience eating at you because you know protecting me is destroying everything you built. My conscience died a long time ago. Liar. She said it without heat, just flat certainty. You wouldn't be drinking if that was true. Caedric stared at her. Then he did something he rarely allowed himself. He laughed. Not the cold, controlled sound he used in ballrooms. A real laugh. Brief, bitter, genuine. God, you're infuriating. I know. You realize you're completely vulnerable here. Under my roof. Under my protection. I could destroy you with a single command. You won't. What makes you so sure, sis? Because if you wanted me destroyed, I'd already be dead. Eveline stepped even closer, close enough now that he could feel the heat from her skin. You don't protect people, Caedric. You acquire assets. You build leverage. You turn human beings into tools, except you can't figure out what to do with me because I won't let you use me and I won't leave. His jaw tightened. Maybe you should. Maybe I should, she agreed. But I won't. Why not? Because someone needs to remind you that power without purpose is just cruelty wearing a crown. The words hit like a blade between his ribs. Caedric reached for her then, one hand sliding around the back of her neck, pulling her close enough that their foreheads almost touched. His voice dropped to barely more than a whisper. You want to know my purpose? You want to know why I burn bridges and destroy rivals and turn every room I enter into a battlefield? Yes, because the world is full of predators. Men like my father who drink themselves to death while their families starve. Men like Hartley who smile while sliding knives between your ribs. Men who take everything they can and justify it with words like tradition and honor and duty. His grip tightened fractionally. I decided a long time ago that I'd rather be the predator than the prey. That I'd rather be feared than pitied. That I'd build something so unassailable that no one could ever take it from me. And has it worked? Until I met you? He smiled, dark and honest. Perfectly. Eveline's breath shuddered. Then she kissed him, not gently, not tentatively. With the same fierce certainty she'd shown walking into that ballroom 6 months ago, knowing it might get her killed. Caedric responded instantly, pulling her against him with bruising force, claiming her mouth like he claimed everything else in his life, completely, ruthlessly, without reservation. She tasted like defiance and firelight and something he couldn't name but desperately needed. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Eveline's eyes blazed with challenge. I'm not one of your acquisitions. I know. I won't be controlled. I know. And I'm going to destroy you if you don't start fighting for something other than power. Caedric smiled. Genuine. Dangerous. I'm counting on it. Took. The next morning arrived with reports of carnage. Caedric sat in his study reviewing documents while rain hammered the windows. Matthias had delivered them an hour ago along with breakfast that Caedric hadn't touched. The whiskey glass sat empty beside scattered papers covered in his sharp, precise handwriting. 3 resignations from Parliament. 2 bankruptcies announced overnight. 1 attempted suicide. Lord Pemberton, who'd apparently decided death was preferable to facing the debts Caedric had called in after last night's disaster. Hartley had issued a public apology at dawn, read from the steps of his estate while journalists scribbled notes and crowds gathered. The words had been carefully crafted by Caedric's solicitors. A complete retraction, an admission of being deceived, a plea for forgiveness. It wouldn't save him. Caedric had already moved the pieces into position. Hartley's shipping contracts would mysteriously fail. His investments would sour. His allies would drift away. Within 6 months, the man who'd tried to destroy a duke would be nothing more than a cautionary tale whispered at parties. This was how Caedric operated. Not with rage, with systematic annihilation. A knock on the study door interrupted his review. Enter. Matthias stepped inside, his expression troubled. Your Grace, there's the visitor. Tell them I'm busy. She insisted I mention her name specifically. Matthias paused. Miss Isolde Marrow. Caedric's pen stopped mid-stroke. Isolde Marrow. Eveline's younger sister. The girl who'd vanished 3 years ago after their father's execution disappeared into the slums of London so thoroughly that even Caedric's resources hadn't found her. Until now. Where is she? The drawing room. She's... Matthias hesitated. Quite distressed, sir. Caedric stood, straightening his coat. Is Eveline awake? She's taking breakfast in her chambers. Don't tell her about this yet. He moved toward the door. Not until I know what we're dealing with. He found Isolde standing by the drawing room windows, staring out at the rain-soaked streets with the haunted expression of someone who'd seen too much suffering. She was younger than Evelyn, 22 to Evelyn's 25, but looked older, worn down by years of survival. Her dress was shabby but clean. Her hands trembled slightly. When she turned and saw Caedric, something flickered across her face. Not fear exactly. Something worse. Recognition. Duke Ashbourne. Her voice was hoarse, damaged. Thank you for seeing me. I didn't know you were in London. I've been here the whole time, hiding. She wrapped her arms around herself. Surviving. Caedric gestured to a chair. Sit. Tell me why you're here. She didn't sit immediately. Instead, she studied him with the same sharp intelligence her sister possessed, measuring, calculating. My sister is under your protection. She is. Why? The directness caught him off guard. Most people approached him with deference, flattery, fear. Isolde Marrow looked at him like she was staring at a wolf and trying to decide if it was hungry. Because she's carrying evidence that powerful men want buried. Because she walked into a den of predators and refused to back down. Because, he stopped, then finished quietly, because she deserves better than what this world tried to give her. Isolde's expression softened fractionally. She thinks you're using her. I am. For what? Leverage. Information. Advantage. Caedric crossed to the sideboard and poured 2 glasses of brandy despite the early hour. He offered one to Isolde. Also because I've discovered that protecting her is the first thing I've done in a decade that doesn't feel like building a prison. Isolde took the glass but didn't drink. Bots. Isolde took the men who killed our father, she said slowly. The ones whose conspiracy Evelyn's trying to expose. They found me. Caedric's expression went completely still. When? 2 days ago. 3 men. They cornered me in an alley near Whitechapel. Her voice remained steady, but her hands shook harder. They said if Evelyn doesn't surrender her evidence and disappear from London, they'll kill me, slowly. They'll make sure she knows exactly how I died. Rage flooded through Caedric like ice water. He set down his glass with careful precision. Did they hurt you? She swallowed. Wait, they made their point clear. Names. Dead. I don't know names, but one of them wore a signet ring, gold, with a crest I recognized from my father's old military records. She pulled a folded paper from her pocket with shaking hands. I drew it from memory. Caedric took the paper and studied the crude sketch. Then his blood went cold. He recognized that crest. It belonged to Lord Chancellor Edmund Blackwell, one of the most powerful men in England, untouchable by law, protected by the crown itself. If Blackwell was directly involved in threatening Isolde, it meant the conspiracy surrounding her father's execution went higher than anyone had suspected. It also meant Evelyn was in more danger than even Caedric had calculated. You came here to warn your sister, he said quietly. I came here to tell her to run. Isolde's voice cracked. To surrender the evidence and disappear before these men destroy what's left of our family. That's not going to happen. You can't stop them. Watch me. Caedric moved to his desk and began writing orders with rapid precision. You'll stay here, under guard. Matthias will arrange secure quarters. No one leaves this house without my explicit permission. Duke Ashbourne. You came to the right place, Miss Marrow, but not for the reasons you think. He looked up from his writing, and Isolde saw something in his expression that made her step back instinctively. Your father was murdered to protect powerful men. Your sister has been hunted for evidence that could topple ministers. You've been threatened, terrorized, driven into hiding. Yes, and I'm done letting that continue. His voice dropped into something lethal. Blackwell wants a war? He'll get one. But when it's over, he's going to understand exactly why threatening people under my protection is the last mistake he'll ever make. Isolde stared at him. You're not doing this for revenge. No. Then why? Caedric smiled. Dark, certain, terrifying. Because I finally found something worth protecting more than my empire. 20 minutes later, Caedric stood outside Evelyn's chambers while rain continued battering the windows. He'd sent word for her to dress and meet him in his study. Matthias had arranged for Isolde to be settled in guest quarters under guard. Now came the hard part, telling Evelyn her sister had resurfaced, telling her about Blackwell's threats, telling her the war was about to escalate beyond anything either of them had anticipated. The door opened and Evelyn stepped into the hallway wearing a dark blue dress, her expression immediately sharp with concern when she saw his face. What happened? Straight to the point. No pleasantries. God, he loved that about her. Your sister is here. Evelyn went white. What? Isolde arrived this morning. She's safe. Under guard in the East Wing. I don't... How? Evelyn's composure shattered. She's been missing for 3 years. I know. Caedric caught her arm gently as she swayed. She came to warn you. The men behind your father's murder have found her. They're using her as leverage to force you to surrender your evidence. The color drained completely from Evelyn's face. Then fury replaced shock. Where is she? I'll take you to her. But first you need to understand what we're dealing with. He guided her toward his study, his hand steady on her arm. The threat came from Lord Chancellor Blackwell. That means this conspiracy reaches the highest levels of government. It means these men will kill to protect themselves. And it means I need to surrender. Evelyn pulled away from him, her eyes blazing. I need to give them what they want before they hurt Isolde. No. You don't get to make that choice. Yes, I do. Caedric's voice went hard. You're under my protection. Your sister is under my protection. And I don't negotiate with predators. She's my sister, which is why you're not thinking clearly. He caught her shoulders, forcing her to meet his gaze. Surrendering won't save her. It won't save you. These men have already proven they'll kill to protect their secrets. Giving them your evidence just makes you both expendable. Tears filled Evelyn's eyes. Then what do we do? Caedric's expression went cold and certain. We destroy them first. She stared at him. Blackwell is untouchable. No one is untouchable. He released her shoulders. Everyone has vulnerabilities. Everyone makes mistakes. Blackwell's mistake was threatening someone I care about. This will start a war. It already is a war. We've just been fighting defensively. Caedric moved to his desk and pulled out a locked drawer, removing documents he'd kept hidden for months. Your father's evidence isn't the only leverage we have. I've been building a case against Blackwell and his allies since the day I realized how deep this conspiracy ran. Evelyn moved closer, studying the documents. What is this, sir? Financial records, correspondence, witness testimonies. His voice was clinical now, detached. Proof that Blackwell and 6 other ministers orchestrated your father's execution to cover up their war profiteering. Proof that they've been systematically eliminating anyone who discovered the truth. You've had this the whole time? I've been collecting it piece by piece. Your evidence was the key that unlocked everything else. He looked at her. But I couldn't move against them without endangering you. They were too powerful, too protected. And now? Now they've made a mistake. Caedric's smile was purely predatory. They've shown me they're desperate enough to threaten your sister openly, which means we've hurt them. And if they're bleeding, they can be killed. Evelyn's hands trembled as she touched the documents. This will destroy half of Parliament. Yes, it could bring down the government. Probably. People will die. Absolutely. Caedric stepped closer. But your father will be vindicated. Your sister will be safe. And the men who've spent years hiding behind power and privilege will finally face consequences. She looked up at him, tears still gleaming in her eyes. You do this for us? I do this because it's right. He touched her face gently. I do it because I'm tired of watching predators win. And I do it because somewhere along the way, protecting you stopped being strategy and became the only thing that matters. Evelyn's breath caught. Then she kissed him with desperate intensity, pouring months of fear and anger and something that felt dangerously close to hope into the contact. When they finally broke apart, her expression had hardened into something determined. Show me everything, every document, every piece of evidence. Her voice steadied. If we're starting a war, I want to know exactly how we're going to win it. Caedric smiled and began laying out the battle plans that would either save them both or destroy everything he'd ever built. The revelation came 3 hours later, buried in correspondence Caedric had obtained through channels he wouldn't name. They were seated at his desk, documents spread across every available surface, when Evelyn suddenly went rigid. Caedric. Her voice carried a quality that made him look up immediately. What is it? She held a letter with shaking hands, her face completely white. This letter, it's from Blackwell to another minister, dated 2 weeks before my father's execution. What? She read aloud, her voice trembling. The girl must be handled carefully. Isolde's testimony could unravel everything if she speaks. Caedric stood, moving around the desk. What does that mean? My sister. Evelyn's eyes met his, filled with dawning horror. She witnessed something that proves Blackwell's involvement. That's why she disappeared. That's why she's been hiding. And now they've found her. Now they've found her and they're using her as bait. Evelyn dropped the letter. This was never about forcing me to surrender my evidence. It's about drawing Isolde into the open so they can silence her permanently. The realization hit Caedric like a physical blow. If Blackwell's men had threatened Isolde 2 days ago, they'd already had time to position resources, arrange contingencies. Coming to Ashbourne House might have been exactly what they wanted, bringing the last witness to their conspiracy directly into reach. And Caedric had just placed her in his most secure location, where she'd be trapped if they attacked. We need to move her, he said immediately, already planning. Scatter locations, different guards. Make her impossible to... The explosion shook the entire house. Glass shattered. Walls trembled. Somewhere in the distance, servants screamed. Caedric grabbed Evelyn and pulled her behind his desk as plaster rained from the ceiling. Stay down! Another explosion. Closer this time, then gunfire. Rapid, professional. Military-grade weapons that had no place in a residential London neighborhood. Caedric's blood went ice cold. Blackwell hadn't just found Isolde. He'd sent an army to finish what he started. And the battle for Ashbourne House, for Evelyn's sister, for the evidence that could topple England's most powerful men, for everything Caedric had built, had just begun. The world reduced itself to 3 sounds. Gunfire tearing through mahogany walls, glass exploding across marble floors, and Evelyn's breathing sharp against his chest as Caedric held her behind the desk that had suddenly become their only cover. His mind processed the attack with brutal efficiency. 4 explosions total. The first 2 at the east gate, diversionary, meant to draw guards. The third targeting the servants' quarters, psychological warfare, maximizing chaos. The fourth at the main entrance, breaching position, military precision. Blackwell hadn't sent thugs, he'd sent professionals. Caedric released Evelyn and moved to the wall panel behind his desk, pressing the hidden release that opened onto a narrow servants' corridor most people didn't know existed. The house had been built during paranoid times by paranoid men. He'd kept every escape route functional for exactly this reason. Nothing in his world existed without purpose, not even architecture. Get to the safe room, he ordered, his voice completely level despite the controlled violence erupting 2 floors below them. East wing, 3rd door past the landing. Matthias knows the protocols. Evelyn grabbed his arm. Where are you going? To get your sister. She held on tighter. Then I'm coming with you. No. Her eyes flashed with the same defiance that had first caught his attention months ago. She's my family, which is why you're going to the safe room where I can protect you both instead of getting killed trying to be heroic. He pulled free from her grip with deliberate gentleness. This isn't negotiable. Evelyn, you don't get to decide. Yes, I do. His voice went cold enough to cut. You came under my roof, my protection. That means following my orders when armed men are trying to kill us. The sound of boots pounding up the main staircase echoed through the walls. Closer now. Coordinated. Moving with the kind of tactical awareness that suggested former military, probably hired from the same circles that had once employed Evelyn's father before they destroyed him. Caedric counted footsteps by sound alone. 6 men, maybe 7. Too many for a direct confrontation without better positioning. He pulled open a drawer in his desk and removed the revolver he kept loaded despite Matthias's perpetual disapproval. The weight felt familiar in his palm, comforting in the way that weapons always did to men who understood that violence was just another language for negotiation. "Go," he said quietly. "Now." Eveline's face twisted with something between rage and terror, but she moved toward the hidden corridor. At the threshold, she stopped and looked back at him with an expression that made his chest tighten in ways he'd spent years training himself not to feel. "If you die, I'll never forgive you. Then I'd better survive." She disappeared into the darkness beyond the panel. Caedric waited 3 seconds to ensure she was clear, then moved toward his study door with the practiced calm of a man who'd learned long ago that panic was just another form of surrender. The hallway outside was chaos. Servants ran past screaming, smoke poured up from the lower floors. Somewhere glass continued shattering in a rhythm that suggested systematic room clearing rather than random destruction. These men weren't here to send a message. They were here to eliminate witnesses. Caedric turned toward the east wing where he'd left Isolde under guard. The route would take him directly through the main landing where the attackers were likely concentrating their assault. But there wasn't another option. The house's defensive advantages meant nothing if he couldn't reach the people he needed to protect. He moved fast and low, using the smoke as cover while his mind calculated trajectories and timing with the same precision he applied to financial markets. A man emerged from the smoke ahead. Black tactical gear, rifle raised, face covered by a balaclava. Professional. Caedric didn't hesitate. He fired twice. Center mass. The training he'd received years ago from a former Prussian military officer came back with muscle memory that required no conscious thought. The attacker dropped. Caedric kept moving, already reloading while stepping over the body without looking down. Sentiment was a luxury afforded to men who didn't have people depending on them to make the hard choices. The East Wing corridor was worse. 2 of his guards lay dead outside Isolde's room, throats cut with the kind of surgical precision that spoke to knife work done by someone who'd killed many times before. Blood pooled across expensive carpet in patterns that would never wash clean. The door to Isolde's quarters stood open, empty. They'd already taken her. Rage flooded through Caedric's veins like ice water, but he forced it down with the discipline of someone who'd learned early that emotion was just another weakness to be exploited. Anger made men sloppy, made them miss details, made them dead. He scanned the room with systematic precision, signs of struggle, overturned furniture, blood on the wall, not enough to suggest fatal injury, which meant they'd wanted her alive. Good. Alive meant leverage. Leverage meant negotiation, and negotiation meant opportunity. Footsteps behind him, fast, multiple sources. Caedric spun and fired 3 times in rapid succession, dropping 2 more attackers before diving behind an overturned dresser as return fire tore chunks out of the wall where his head had been seconds earlier. The mathematics of survival were brutal and simple. 7 rounds remaining, at least 3 hostiles still mobile, unknown numbers still clearing lower floors, Eveline hopefully secure in the safe room. Isolde taken but alive. Variables narrowing, options crystallizing. He waited for the pause in gunfire that meant reloading, then moved. Not toward the attackers, toward the servants' staircase that would take him down and around to where they'd likely staged their extraction point. If they'd taken Isolde, they'd need a vehicle, probably positioned at the rear courtyard where the walls provided cover from street observation. His guess proved correct 30 seconds later when he emerged into the courtyard through a side entrance and saw the black carriage waiting beside the garden gate. 2 men loading a struggling figure wrapped in blankets into the vehicle, while a third provided overwatch. Isolde. Still fighting despite being bound and gagged. Still refusing to surrender even when outmatched and terrified. The Marrow sisters shared that particular brand of stubborn courage that got people killed unless someone more ruthless intervened. Caedric raised his revolver and shot the Overwatch guard before the man registered his presence. The sound echoed across the courtyard like thunder, causing the 2 men loading Isolde to spin toward him with weapons rising. He'd already moved by then, using the garden wall for cover while putting 2 more rounds through the nearest attacker's chest. The last man grabbed Isolde and pressed a knife to her throat, using her as a shield while backing toward the carriage. "Drop it!" the man snarled, his accent marking him as East End born despite the military bearing. "Drop the gun or she dies." Caedric stopped moving. His revolver remained perfectly steady, aimed at the narrow gap between Isolde's shoulder and her captor's head. A difficult shot. Not impossible. But with Isolde struggling, The margin for error was measured in fractions of inches. He ran the calculations. 80% chance of a clean kill, 20% chance the bullet would clip Isolde instead, 20% chance of traumatizing Evelyn permanently by getting her sister killed during a rescue attempt. Unacceptable odds. Caedric lowered the revolver. Smart choice, the man said, continuing his backward movement toward the carriage. Now kick it away. Who sent you? You know who? Blackwell? The man smiled behind his balaclava. Lord Chancellor, don't leave loose ends. Should have surrendered the evidence when you had the chance. Where are you taking her? Somewhere the screaming won't bother neighbors. Caedric's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes made the man's smile falter. You've made a mistake, Caedric said quietly. The man laughed. I'm holding a knife to her throat and you're unarmed. What mistake? You assumed I'd let you leave. The confusion in the man's eyes lasted exactly long enough for Caedric to lunge forward with speed that shouldn't have been possible from a standing position. Years of training, years of surviving in rooms full of predators, years of turning his body into a weapon when words failed, all of it condensed into 3 seconds of brutal efficiency. He caught the man's knife hand at the wrist, twisted until bones cracked, and drove his elbow into the attacker's throat with enough force to crush the windpipe. The man dropped. Isolde stumbled free, still bound, her eyes wild with terror above the gag. Caedric caught her before she fell, already scanning the courtyard for additional threats, while his pulse remained perfectly steady. The bodies around them would need to be dealt with. Questions would need to be answered. But first, he pulled the gag from Isolde's mouth and began working on the ropes binding her wrists. Are you hurt? She shook her head, gasping for air. They were going to. I know. His hands moved with practiced efficiency, untying knots while keeping his attention split between her face and the courtyard perimeter. Where are the others? Others? The rest of Blackwell's men. They sent at least a dozen. Isolde's eyes widened. I don't know. They grabbed me and... Movement at the courtyard entrance. Caedric spun, reaching for the revolver he'd dropped during the fight. But it was Matthias who emerged from the smoke, his usually immaculate butler's attire torn and blood-stained, carrying a rifle that looked absurdly military in his aged hands. Your Grace. His voice remained perfectly composed despite the circumstances. The attackers have been repelled. 4 casualties among our staff, 8 confirmed hostile deaths. The remainder fled when they realized resistance was organized. Caedric absorbed the information while finishing untying Isolde. Evelyn? Secure in the safe room as ordered. Matthias allowed himself the smallest expression of disapproval, though quite vocal about her displeasure at being separated from the combat. Of course she was. Caedric helped Isolde to her feet, steadying her when she swayed. Get them both to the safe room. No one enters without my explicit authorization. I don't care if the king himself demands access. Matthias nodded. And you, sir? I need to send a message. His voice went cold. Blackwell wanted to demonstrate that no one under my protection is safe. Time to teach him what happens when you start wars you're not prepared to finish. The safe room beneath Ashbourne House had been designed by the same paranoid architects who'd built the escape corridors, reinforced with steel and concrete that could withstand everything short of artillery. Caedric found Evelyn pacing like a caged wolf, her face pale, but her eyes blazing with barely controlled fury. She turned when the door opened and her expression shifted through relief, anger, and something more complicated when she saw Isolde being supported by Matthias. Issy. The sisters collided in an embrace that made Caedric's chest tighten with emotions he'd spent years refusing to acknowledge. Evelyn was crying. Isolde was shaking, both of them holding each other with the desperate intensity of people who'd survived too much loss. He gave them 60 seconds, then cleared his throat. We need to talk. Evelyn pulled back from her sister, wiping her eyes with sharp, angry movements. You could have been killed. But I wasn't. You could have been... Evelyn. His voice cut through her rising panic with surgical precision. I wasn't killed. Your sister is safe. But we need to discuss what happens next, because Blackwell just declared total war, and we have approximately 12 hours before he moves again. She stared at him. 12 hours? Conservative estimate. He lost men tonight. Expensive, trained men. He'll need time to regroup and deploy new resources. But he won't stop. Not now. Not after committing this publicly. Isolde spoke up, her voice hoarse. He'll kill us all. Eventually, yes, if we let him. Caedric moved to the table in the center of the room and spread out documents he'd grabbed from his study before descending. But we're not going to let him. Evelyn crossed to the table, her fear hardening into something more useful. What's your plan? We expose everything. All of it. Every piece of evidence we have about the conspiracy, the war profiteering, your father's execution. We deliver it simultaneously to every major newspaper, every opposition member of parliament, every judge who isn't in Blackwell's pocket. That will take days to organize. It's already organized. I've had contingency plans in place for weeks. He pulled out a list of names and addresses. These are the people who will receive sealed packages tomorrow morning if I give the order. Journalists, politicians, military officers, people who hate Blackwell enough to act on the evidence regardless of personal risk. Isolde moved closer, studying the list. This will destroy half the government. Yes. It could trigger riots, political collapse. Probably. People will die. Absolutely. Caedric met her eyes with brutal honesty. But they're already dying. Your father died. My guards died tonight. How many others has Blackwell murdered to protect his fortune? How many more will die if we do nothing? The silence stretched. Then Evelyn spoke, her voice steady. Do it. Caedric looked at her. You understand what this means? Once we expose this, there's no going back. Blackwell and his allies will use every resource they have to destroy us. We'll be fighting the most powerful men in England with nothing but evidence in the hope that enough people still care about truth. I understand. We could lose everything. We already have nothing except each other and the truth. Her eyes held his with fierce certainty. So let's burn their empire down and see what rises from the ashes. God, she was magnificent. Caedric turned to Matthias. Send the signal. All packages deploy at dawn. Very good, sir. Matthias departed with his usual unflappable efficiency. Isolde was still studying the documents, her expression troubled. There's something you should know. Her voice was quiet. About why Blackwell is so desperate. We know he's protecting his war profiteering. It's worse than that. She looked up, and Caedric saw something in her eyes that made his blood run cold. I witnessed the meeting where they planned it, the conspiracy. I was 16, hiding in my father's study because I'd snuck out and needed to return without being caught. They didn't know I was there. What meeting? The night they decided to frame my father for treason. Isolde's hands trembled as she touched the documents. Blackwell was there. So were 6 other ministers. They were panicking because my father had discovered their smuggling operation, weapons sold to both sides of the war, profiting from British and enemy deaths alike. Evelyn went white. Father knew? He was going to expose them. So they decided to destroy him first. Isolde's voice cracked. They fabricated evidence, bribed witnesses, orchestrated a trial that was over before it began. And I heard all of it, every word, every name, every detail. Caedric's mind raced. You're the witness that can corroborate everything. I'm the only witness. The other people in that room are either part of the conspiracy or dead. Isolde met his gaze. That's why Blackwell wants me silenced. Your evidence proves what happened. My testimony proves they planned it with premeditation. Together, it's not just scandal. It's execution-level treason. The weight of that realization settled over the room like a physical presence. They thought they were fighting to expose corruption. They were actually holding proof of high treason against the crown, punishment for which was death. Can you testify? Caedric asked quietly. Under oath, in front of Parliament. Isolde hesitated. If I do, they'll kill me. They're trying to kill you anyway. Fair point. She smiled without humor. Then yes, I'll testify. I'll tell the world exactly what these monsters did to my father. Evelyn grabbed her sister's hand. We're in this together. Together. Caedric watched them both. These 2 women who'd survived impossible circumstances and still refused to break, and made a decision that went against every survival instinct he'd honed over decades. I need to tell you something. They both looked at him. What Blackwell did to your father, the conspiracy, the murder, the cover-up? His jaw tightened. I knew about it 6 months before I ever met Evelyn. The silence was absolute. Evelyn's expression went carefully blank. What? I'd been investigating Blackwell's finances for years, building evidence, looking for leverage. He took a breath. When your father was executed, I noticed irregularities in the trial, started digging deeper, found the money trails, the forged documents, the paid witnesses. I knew it was orchestrated. Then why didn't you do anything? Evelyn's voice was dangerously quiet. Because I didn't care. His honesty landed like a blade. Your father was dead. Blackwell was untouchable. The evidence I had wasn't enough to guarantee success, and I don't start wars I can't win. Evelyn took a step back. You knew my father was innocent, and you did nothing? I did what I always do. I collected information and waited for the right opportunity to use it. He met her gaze without flinching. That's who I am, Evelyn. That's who I've always been. I don't save people out of kindness. I acquire assets and deploy them when advantageous. Then why tell us now? Because you deserve to know who you're trusting. His voice softened fractionally. And because I'm tired of pretending that protecting you is purely strategic. I could have used your evidence without getting personally involved. Could have orchestrated Blackwell's downfall from a distance. But I didn't. Why not? Because somewhere between meeting you and tonight, I stopped seeing people as assets and started seeing them as people worth dying for. He looked at Isolde. Your testimony will destroy Blackwell. My resources will protect you through the aftermath. And Evelyn's evidence will ensure that history remembers your father as a hero instead of a traitor. Then what do you get? Isolde asked. Nothing. Everything. He smiled without humor. I get to watch the empire I built crumble because I chose loyalty over power. I get to become a target for every enemy Blackwell has cultivated. I get to risk execution for treason if this goes wrong. And if it goes right, then maybe I get to be someone other than the ruthless bastard who sees everything as leverage. Evelyn was crying again, but her voice remained steady. You're an absolute bastard, I know. And you should have done something years ago. I know. And I'm furious with you for being exactly the kind of monster I thought you were. I know. She crossed the distance between them and grabbed his face with both hands, forcing him to meet her blazing eyes. But you're my monster, and we're going to destroy Blackwell together, and then you're going to spend the rest of your life trying to be better than the man you were. He caught her wrist gently. That's a terrible plan. It's the only one we have. Isolde cleared her throat. As touching as this is, we have approximately 11 hours before dawn and a conspiracy to dismantle. Perhaps we could focus? Caedric smiled. I like her. Evelyn pulled back, wiping her eyes. Fine. What's our move? We triple the guard on this room. We send the evidence packages at dawn, and we prepare for Blackwell's retaliation. He looked at both sisters. Because once this information goes public, he'll have nothing left to lose, which makes him infinitely more dangerous than he was before. What can he do that's worse than trying to kill us? Use the Crown's authority to declare us traitors. Issue warrants for our arrest. Turn the full power of the state against us before the evidence has time to spread. Caedric's expression hardened. We'll have maybe 48 hours between exposure and official retaliation. That's our window to survive. How do we survive the Crown? We make ourselves too valuable to kill. His mind was already calculating moves and countermoves. We give interviews, public testimonies. Make sure every newspaper in England knows our faces and our story. Martyrdom is only useful if people remember you. And if they arrest us anyway, then we fight from prison. He met Evelyn's eyes. I told you before. I don't start wars I can't win, but I also don't surrender just because the odds are bad. The door opened and Matthias returned, his expression grave. Your Grace, we have a problem. Define problem. Lord Chancellor Blackwell is outside the front gate. Matthias paused. With 50 armed guards and a warrant for your arrest signed by the Crown itself. Caedric's blood went cold. 11 hours had been optimistic. They'd had less than 3. What are the charges? Harboring fugitives, conspiracy against the state, murder of Crown investigators during tonight's attack. Matthias's voice remained steady. The warrant is comprehensive, legal, irrefutable. Evelyn grabbed Caedric's arm. This is impossible. They can't have processed charges this quickly, unless they were prepared in advance. Caedric understood with brutal clarity. Blackwell planned this. The attack wasn't meant to succeed. It was meant to provide legal justification for what comes next. Isolde's face went white. He's using the Crown to finish what his assassins started. Elegant, really. Caedric's mind raced through options, discarding them as quickly as they formed. Can't fight the Crown's authority directly. Can't run without looking guilty. Can't surrender without getting killed in custody. The mathematics of survival were narrowing to a single point. What do we do? Evelyn's voice was steady despite the fear in her eyes. Caedric looked at her, then at Isolde, then at Matthias, who'd served his family for 40 years with unquestioning loyalty. We do the one thing Blackwell won't expect, which is we walk out there and surrender. The room exploded in protest. That's suicide. He'll kill you the moment you're in custody. Your Grace, I must strongly advise. Caedric raised a hand and the voices stopped. Listen to me, all of you. He spoke with the calm certainty of someone who'd made a decision and would not be moved. Blackwell wants us dead, yes, but he wants us discredited first. Wants the world to believe we're traitors so our evidence dies with our reputations. So we deny him that. We surrender publicly, in front of witnesses, with the evidence already deployed to spread while we're in custody. His eyes hardened. We make ourselves the story. The Duke who chose truth over power. The sisters who risked everything to avenge their father. The evidence that powerful men would rather commit treason than let surface. That still ends with us dead. Maybe. He looked at Evelyn. Or maybe it ends with enough people caring about the truth that killing us becomes more dangerous than letting us live. You're gambling our lives on maybe? I'm gambling our lives on the one thing I've learned in 34 years of surviving in this world. He smiled without humor. Stories are more powerful than soldiers. And right now, we need to be a story worth telling. The silence stretched. Then Isolde spoke, her voice quiet but firm. I'll testify. In court. In public. Wherever they put me. She looked at Caedric. But you need to promise me something. What? If they kill us anyway? You make sure the story spreads. You make sure the world knows what Blackwell did. I promise. Evelyn took a shuddering breath. This is insane. Yes. We're probably going to die. Probably. And you think this is better than fighting? I think this is the only fight worth having. He caught her hand, holding it with unexpected gentleness. Power isn't about who holds the weapons. It's about who holds the truth. And right now, we hold truth worth dying for. She stared at him for a long moment, then kissed him with desperate intensity, pouring everything she couldn't say into the contact. When they finally broke apart, her eyes were dry. Let's go make history. The walk from Ashbourne House to the front gate where Blackwell waited felt like crossing into execution. Dawn was breaking over London in shades of gray and gold. The street was filled with soldiers wearing the Crown's colors, their rifles held ready, their expressions carefully neutral. Behind them, a crowd had gathered, early morning workers, curious neighbors, journalists who'd caught wind of something important happening. Perfect. Caedric had changed into formal attire. Dark coat, perfectly knotted cravat. The appearance of a duke who had nothing to fear from mere accusations. Evelyn walked beside him in a simple dress, her head high, her hand steady in his. Isolde followed, flanked by Matthias, who'd refused to let them surrender without proper escort. Lord Chancellor Blackwell stood at the center of the Crown's forces, silver-haired and smiling with the confidence of a man who believed he'd already won. Duke Ashbourne, his voice carried across the street. How civilized of you to surrender peacefully. Caedric stopped 10 feet from him, close enough to be heard by the crowd, but far enough to maintain the appearance of dignity. I'm surrendering to the Crown's authority, not to you. His voice was clear, projecting. There's a difference. Blackwell's smile tightened. The charges are serious. The charges are fabricated. Caedric spoke to the crowd now, not to Blackwell. Fabricated by men desperate to silence evidence of treason that reaches the highest levels of government. Murmurs rippled through the gathered people. Careful, Ashbourne. Blackwell's voice went hard. Accusations without proof are sedition. I have proof. So does Miss Marrow. So does her sister. He gestured to Isolde. Proof that's already been distributed to every major newspaper in England. By noon today, the entire country will know exactly what you and your allies did. Blackwell's face went white. You're lying. Am I? Caedric smiled. Then you have nothing to worry about. Arrest me. Put me on trial. Let's see whose evidence holds up under oath. The silence was absolute. Then Blackwell made his mistake. He signaled the soldiers with a sharp gesture. Arrest them, all of them, and confiscate any documents in their possession. The soldiers moved forward. The crowd pressed closer, watching, witnessing. Caedric let himself be seized, let the cold iron of handcuffs close around his wrists, let Blackwell's men search him roughly while maintaining his expression of complete calm. This was the point of no return. The moment where everything he'd built, power, reputation, empire, would either survive or shatter based on whether the story spreading through London was stronger than the force trying to suppress it. As they dragged him toward the waiting prison transport, Caedric looked back at Evelyn one last time. She stood straight despite the soldiers holding her eyes blazing with defiant pride. And in that moment, Caedric understood something fundamental that had eluded him for 34 years. Power wasn't about control. It was about knowing what you'd die for, and he'd finally found something worth the price. The prison transport smelled like fear and old blood. Caedric sat with his hands shackled, the iron biting into his wrists with rhythmic precision as the carriage lurched through London's cobblestone streets. Across from him, Evelyn maintained her composure with the rigid control of someone refusing to give their captors the satisfaction of visible terror. Isolde sat beside her sister, pale but silent, her eyes tracking every soldier's movement with the hypervigilance of prey that had survived too many hunts. They were being taken to the Tower, not to some common jail where lawyers could file writs and sympathetic judges might intervene. The Tower of London, where traitors had rotted for centuries, where the Crown's justice moved with medieval certainty and modern brutality. Blackwell had planned this meticulously. Caedric's mind catalogued the variables with mechanical precision despite the circumstances. The evidence packages would be delivered within hours. Newspapers would run the story. Public opinion would shift. But all of that required time they might not have, because men like Blackwell didn't arrest enemies just to hold them. They arrested them to disappear them. The carriage jerked to a stop. Doors opened onto gray morning light, and the tower's ancient walls looming like a monument to state-sanctioned murder. Soldiers hauled them out roughly, Evelyn stumbling on the cobblestones before catching herself with that stubborn grace that made Caedric's chest ache. Inside, the corridor stank of damp stone and centuries of suffering. Their footsteps echoed in patterns that sounded like countdown timers. They were separated at the first junction. Evelyn and Isolde dragged one direction, Caedric another. He didn't fight it. Fighting accomplished nothing except giving them justification for violence, and he needed to conserve his strength for what came next. His cell was exactly what he expected. Stone walls, iron bars, a bucket in the corner that reeked of previous occupants. The door slammed shut with finality that felt designed to break spirits before interrogations even began. Caedric sat on the narrow bench and waited. Time moved strangely in darkness. Minutes felt like hours. Hours compressed into moments. He tracked the passage by counting his own heartbeats, a meditation technique learned from a Buddhist monk he'd once hired to teach him emotional control, before realizing emotion was easier to weaponize than eliminate. Eventually, footsteps approached. Multiple sets, heavy boots, the purposeful rhythm of men who knew exactly what they were about to do. The cell door opened. Lord Chancellor Blackwell entered flanked by two guards, his expression carrying the satisfied calm of a hunter standing over fresh kill. Duke Ashbourne, how unfortunate to see you reduced to these circumstances. Caedric remained seated, his posture relaxed despite the shackles. Is this the part where you offer me a deal? Blackwell smiled. No deals. You've already lost, have I? Your evidence packages? Intercepted. Every courier, every delivery, every contingency you arranged. He pulled a folded paper from his coat and let it flutter to the cell floor. We've been watching you for months. Did you truly believe I wouldn't anticipate your moves? The words landed like physical blows. Caedric's mind raced, recalculating, searching for the flaw in Blackwell's claim. The packages had been distributed through independent channels, paid handlers who didn't know each other, staggered timing to prevent coordinated interception. Unless someone had given Blackwell the complete distribution plan. Someone inside Caedric's own organization. You're lying. His voice remained steady through sheer force of will. Am I? Blackwell gestured to the guards. Bring her in. The door opened wider, and Caedric's world shattered, because the woman who walked into his cell wearing expensive silk and a smile cold enough to freeze blood was someone he'd trusted with every secret, every plan, every vulnerability he possessed. Lady Seraphina Everly, his former fiancée. Hello, darling. Her voice dripped with poisoned honey. Did you miss me? Caedric's expression remained neutral through years of practiced control. But something behind his eyes must have shown because Seraphina's smile widened. Oh, that look. That's the one I've been waiting months to see. The great Duke Ashbourne finally realizing he's been outmaneuvered. Blackwell moved to stand beside her, and the pieces clicked into place with brutal clarity. They'd been working together the entire time. You ended our engagement 3 months ago, Seraphina continued, circling him like a predator savoring wounded prey. Humiliated me in front of Parliament, chose that nobody girl over me. Did you think I'd simply accept that? This was revenge. Caedric's voice was flat. All of this. Revenge is such an ugly word. Seraphina's eyes glittered. I prefer justice. You took everything from me. My status, my future, my dignity. So I decided to take everything from you. The attack on Ashbourne House. Staged beautifully, wasn't it? She laughed. Just enough violence to justify the warrant, but carefully choreographed to ensure you'd do exactly what Blackwell predicted. Surrender publicly. Deploy your evidence. Make yourself the martyr. Except the evidence never deployed. Because I gave Lord Blackwell your entire distribution network. Every name, every address, every courier. She leaned closer, her perfume sickeningly familiar. You trusted me with so much during our engagement, Caedric. All those late nights discussing business, all those strategic conversations. You never realized I was cataloging every weakness. The scope of the betrayal was breathtaking. Caedric had spent months building contingencies, believing himself protected by layers of secrecy and misdirection. But Seraphina had been inside those defenses from the beginning, learning the architecture of his empire while pretending to love him. And he'd never suspected, because he'd categorized her as harmless, as sentimental, as someone whose emotions made her weak rather than dangerous. The greatest failure wasn't underestimating Blackwell. It was underestimating the woman he'd discarded. Where are Evelyn and her sister? His voice remained controlled despite the rage building behind his ribs. Safe. For now. Blackwell's tone was clinical. Their cells are quite comfortable, and they'll remain that way as long as you cooperate. Define cooperate. Sign a confession. Admit to treason, conspiracy, murder. Take full responsibility for everything. He pulled out a document covered in official seals. Do that, and the Marrow sisters will be released. Quietly. With enough money to disappear somewhere far from England. You'll kill them anyway. Eventually, yes. But not immediately. And not painfully if you sign quickly. Blackwell's expression didn't change. Refuse, and I'll have them executed publicly as your accomplices. Slowly. Creatively. I'll make sure you hear every scream. The choice was elegant in its cruelty. Sign a false confession and die knowing he'd betrayed everything he claimed to stand for. Refuse and condemn Evelyn and Isolde to torture and death. Either way, Blackwell won. Either way, the truth died with them. Caedric looked at Seraphina, seeing her clearly for perhaps the first time. Not as the aristocratic ornament he'd once considered marrying for political advantage, but as something far more dangerous. A woman with nothing left to lose and everything to gain from his destruction. You could have been a duchess, he said quietly. Could have had power, wealth, influence beyond measure. I didn't want to be your duchess. Her voice went hard. I wanted to be your equal, your partner. But you saw me as a prop, something decorative to stand beside you at parties while you built your empire. So you destroyed it instead. I helped destroy a tyrant. She smiled. History will remember me kindly for it. Blackwell cleared his throat. Enough sentiment. Sign the confession, Ashbourne. You have 1 hour to decide. They left him alone with the document and a pen. Caedric sat in silence, staring at paper that might as well have been his death warrant, regardless of whether he signed it. The mathematics were brutal. Sign and die knowing the truth died with him. Refuse and listen to the women he'd promised to protect die screaming. No good options. No clever strategies. Just the raw arithmetic of impossible choices. Time passed in heartbeats and shallow breathing. Then footsteps approached again. Different rhythm, lighter, familiar. The cell door opened and Matthias slipped inside, moving with surprising speed for a man his age. He pressed a finger to his lips, then gestured urgently toward the corner where shadows pooled deepest. Caedric stood and moved closer. Matthias spoke in barely more than a whisper, his words tumbling out with uncharacteristic urgency. The packages deployed. Not all of them, but enough. Relief flooded through Caedric's veins like oxygen after drowning. How? I maintained a secondary distribution network, completely separate from the one you shared with Miss Everly. His voice carried the faintest edge of disapproval. Forgive me, Your Grace, but I never trusted her completely. Caedric could have kissed the old man. How many got through? 17 of 25, already being printed in morning editions. The story is spreading faster than Blackwell can suppress it. And Evelyn? Alive, being held 2 levels down. Mrs. Olda as well. Matthias hesitated, but Blackwell has ordered their execution scheduled for sunset if you don't sign. 6 hours. Can you get them out? Not without you. The guards are tripled. The tower is locked down. Matthias met his eyes with steady certainty. But I can get you a weapon. One chance, if you're willing to take it. What kind of weapon? The kind that means you'll be killing crown soldiers to escape. The kind that makes you a traitor, in fact, rather than just accusation. His voice dropped even lower. The kind that means you can never return to England if you survive. The weight of that reality settled like stone. Everything Caedric had built, his title, his reputation, his empire, would be forfeit the moment he raised a weapon against the crown's authority. Even if the newspapers exposed Blackwell's conspiracy, even if public opinion turned, escape would brand him a fugitive forever. But staying meant death, and letting Evelyn and Isolde die was unthinkable. The choice crystallized with brutal simplicity: power or people, empire or truth, the man he'd been or the man he might become. Do it! His voice was steady. Get me the weapon. Matthias nodded and withdrew a small bundle from inside his coat. Inside was a knife, barely 6 inches of blade, but sharp enough to kill if used correctly. One of the guards is sympathetic. Old military, hates Blackwell. He'll create a distraction in exactly 10 minutes near the East Corridor. That's your window. And then? Then you run. There's a boat waiting at the docks. Captain doesn't ask questions if you pay enough. He'll take you to France. Beyond that, you're on your own. Caedric took the knife, feeling its weight, its purpose. Matthias, thank you. The old butler's expression softened fractionally. You're a difficult man to serve, Your Grace. Ruthless, often cruel. But you're the first employer in 40 years who's ever chosen to be better than circumstance demanded. He slipped back into the corridor before Caedric could respond. 10 minutes. Caedric positioned himself behind the cell door, knife concealed, every muscle coiled with the controlled violence he'd learned from street fights before his father's death had forced him to become something more calculated. The sounds of the tower surrounded him. Distant voices, metal scraping stone, water dripping somewhere in darkness. Then an explosion, not massive, controlled. Somewhere in the East Corridor, exactly as Matthias had promised. Shouting erupted, guards running, chaos spreading through stone corridors with the inevitability of fire through dry timber. The guard outside Caedric's cell hesitated, then ran toward the commotion, leaving the door unlocked. Caedric moved. He slipped into the corridor, pressed against the wall, tracking movement by sound and shadow. The layout of the tower was medieval complexity, but he'd studied it years ago during a different crisis. The cells holding Evelyn and Isolde would be 2 levels down, accessible through the spiral staircase 40 feet ahead. He made it 20 feet before encountering his first obstacle. A guard rounding the corner, young, alert, hand already moving toward his weapon. Caedric didn't hesitate. He drove the knife up under the man's rib cage with surgical precision, angling toward the heart, one hand clamped over the guard's mouth to muffle any sound. The body went slack. Caedric lowered it quietly to the floor and kept moving. No time for guilt, no room for hesitation, just the brutal calculus of survival. 2 more guards at the staircase. These ones older, more experienced, positioned to block exactly the kind of escape attempt Caedric was making. He couldn't take them both in direct confrontation, so he didn't try. He grabbed a loose stone from the wall and hurled it down a side corridor. The sound echoed like footsteps. Both guards turned toward it, weapons raised. Caedric moved in from behind. The first guard died before he understood what was happening. The second managed to draw his pistol, but Caedric caught his wrist, twisted until bones cracked, and drove the knife into his throat. Blood sprayed across ancient stone. Caedric kept moving, descending the spiral staircase with rapid precision, while his mind screamed statistics about time running out and odds narrowing with every second. The lower level was darker, damper, designed to break prisoners through sensory deprivation before interrogation even began. Cell doors lined both walls, identical, unmarked. He tried the first door. Empty. Second door. Empty. Third door. Evelyn looked up from where she sat curled against the wall, her eyes widening when she saw him covered in blood and holding a knife like some nightmare vision. Caedric. No time. He worked on the lock with hands that remained steady despite everything. "Where's Isolde?" "3 doors down." Evelyn stood, swaying slightly. "What's happening?" "We're leaving." The lock clicked open. "Now!" They ran to Isolde's cell. The lock here was newer, more complex, designed to hold more valuable prisoners. Caedric's hands moved with desperate speed, manipulating mechanisms while footsteps echoed somewhere above them. Closer now. Search pattern adjusting. Discovery inevitable. The lock finally gave way just as shouts erupted from the stairwell. Isolde stumbled out, pale and shaking but mobile. "Follow me." Caedric grabbed Evelyn's hand and ran. The route out was improvised chaos. Caedric navigated by instinct and memory, choosing corridors at random, doubling back when they hit dead ends, always moving towards the outer walls where Matthias had promised a way out. They burst into a storage room and Caedric spotted it, a drainage grate leading to the sewers beneath the tower. The escape route used by prisoners throughout history when guards could be bribed and desperation outweighed dignity. He pried up the grate with the knife, revealing darkness that stank of human waste and decay. Down. Now. "You can't be serious." "Evelyn," his voice cut through her protest. "We go down or we die up here. Choose." She chose. They descended into filth and darkness, Caedric going last and replacing the grate behind them. The sewer tunnel was narrow, forcing them to move single file through water that came up to their knees and smelled like concentrated suffering. But it led away from the tower, away from Blackwell, away from cells and execution warrants, and the architecture of betrayal that had nearly destroyed them. 20 minutes of stumbling through sewage brought them to an outlet near the Thames docks. They emerged into morning light like creatures born from London's underbelly, covered in filth, gasping clean air. Matthias was waiting beside a small boat, his expression carefully neutral despite the state of them. "The captain is paid. He'll take you to Calais. Beyond that, you're on your own." Caedric helped Evelyn and Isolde onto the boat, then turned to face Matthias one last time. "What will you do? Return to Ashbourne House and claim ignorance of your escape?" The old butler smiled faintly. "I'm too old to hang, your grace. They'll believe me senile. Matthias, go." His voice was firm. "The story is spreading. The newspapers are printing everything. Blackwell's empire is crumbling even as we speak. You gave England the truth. Now give yourself a chance to survive it." Caedric wanted to say something profound, something worthy of 40 years of loyal service. Instead, he simply nodded and climbed onto the boat. The captain cast off without ceremony, pushing away from the dock into the Thames current. London receded behind them, the tower visible in the distance like a monument to everything Caedric was leaving behind. He stood at the stern, watching his empire disappear, while Evelyn and Isolde huddled together in the bow. Everything he'd built, everything he'd been, gone, sacrificed for 2 women and a truth that might not even matter in the end. The mathematics should have been simple. Power versus people. Empire versus escape. Logic versus emotion. But standing there covered in sewage and blood, watching England fade into morning mist, Caedric understood something fundamental he'd spent 34 years refusing to learn. Power built on fear was just a prison with better furniture. And the only freedom worth having was the kind you could share with people who saw your worst self and chose to stay anyway. Evelyn appeared beside him, her hand finding his despite the filth covering both of them. "We lost everything. I know. Your title, your fortune, your empire. I know. And we're fugitives now. Criminals. We can never go back." "I know." He looked at her, really looked at her, seen past the grime to the fierce determination that had first caught his attention. "But I'm not sure I lost anything that mattered." She studied his face for a long moment, then kissed him with salt spray and sewage taste, and something that felt dangerously like hope. When they broke apart, her eyes held his with steady certainty. "What do we do now?" Caedric looked toward the horizon where France waited, then back at London, disappearing into distance. "We survive. We rebuild. And we make sure Blackwell's conspiracy burns hot enough that even crossing the channel won't stop people from watching it collapse. How? The old way. He smiled without humor. I spent decades building networks, cultivating contacts, creating leverage. Those don't disappear just because I'm exiled. We use them. We feed information to the journalist who printed our evidence. We become the story that won't die. From France? From wherever we need to be. His voice hardened with familiar certainty. Blackwell thinks he won because he forced us out of England, but he's forgotten the most important rule of war. What's that? The man with nothing left to lose is the most dangerous enemy of all. The boat reached Calais 3 hours later under gray skies that matched the coastline's bleakness. They disembarked with nothing but the clothes on their backs and the stench of London sewers still clinging to their skin. The captain departed without a word, already forgetting their faces with the practiced amnesia of someone who'd smuggled enough fugitives to know silence was survival. Caedric led them through the port town's narrow streets toward a boarding house he'd used years ago during business negotiations that had required discretion. The proprietor recognized him despite the filth, French pragmatism trumping English warrants. 3 rooms, hot water, privacy. The woman nodded and produced keys without asking questions. They cleaned in silence, washing away literal and metaphorical sewage until the water ran clear. Caedric stood under scalding spray and watched England's blood and filth spiral down the drain while his mind cataloged next moves with mechanical precision. Resources, limited but not zero. He maintained accounts in France under false names, contingency funds for exactly this kind of emergency. Enough to survive 6 months if they were careful. Contacts, extensive. Years of business had given him relationships across Europe with people who valued profit over politics. Leverage, the evidence already spreading through London newspapers. Blackwell couldn't suppress it forever. Public opinion would turn. Timeline? Uncertain. Weeks? Months? Years before England became safe again? If it ever did. The thought should have terrified him. Instead, standing in that cramped boarding house bathroom, Caedric felt something he hadn't experienced in decades. Relief. The empire he'd built had been magnificent, terrifying, absolutely necessary for survival in a world that devoured weakness. But it had also been a prison. Every alliance had been a chain. Every victory had demanded the sacrifice of something human. Every day had required maintaining the image of invulnerability that made men fear him enough to obey. Now that image was shattered. The ruthless Duke of Ashbourne was a fugitive covered in sewage, hiding in a French boarding house with nothing but the 2 women he'd somehow decided were worth more than everything else combined. And for the first time in years, he could breathe. A knock on the door pulled him from the spiral of thought. Caedric. Evelyn's voice. He dried quickly and opened the door to find her standing there wearing borrowed clothes that didn't fit properly, her hair still damp, her expression carrying the weight of everything they'd survived in the past 12 hours. Can we talk? He stepped aside and she entered, closing the door behind her with the kind of deliberate care that suggested the conversation ahead wouldn't be easy. They sat on the narrow bed that dominated the small room. Silence stretched between them like a physical barrier. Then Evelyn spoke, her voice quiet but firm. You killed people today. Yes. Crowned soldiers, men who were just following orders. Yes. And you'd do it again if you had to, without hesitation. He met her eyes. Does that change how you see me? She was quiet for a long moment, her gaze searching his face with the same fierce intelligence that had always unsettled him. I've spent 6 months watching you operate, watching you destroy rivals, manipulate allies, treat people like chess pieces. Part of me always wondered if there was anything human left underneath all that calculation. And now? Now I've seen you sacrifice everything for me and my sister. I've seen you kill to protect us. I've seen you choose exile over compromise. She took a breath. So yes, it changes how I see you. His chest tightened. You're not just the ruthless Duke anymore. You're someone who discovered he's capable of caring more about people than power. She caught his hand. And that's more terrifying than anything you did before. Why terrifying? Because power is predictable. It follows rules. But love? Her voice cracked slightly. Love makes people do insane things. Like throwing away empires for fugitive sisters and women who carry evidence that gets them hunted. Is that what this is? he asked quietly. Love? Evelyn laughed, brittle and honest. I don't know. Maybe. Probably. She looked at their joined hands. All I know is that when those soldiers dragged you away, I realized I'd rather die beside you than live safely without you, which is either love or insanity. Could be both. Probably is. The silence returned, but softer now, carrying less weight. Then Isolde's voice came through the thin wall separating their rooms. If you two are done having emotional revelations, we need to discuss what happens next. Caedric smiled despite everything. Your sister has impeccable timing. She learned it from watching our father navigate political disasters. Evelyn stood, pulling him with her. Come on. Let's plan our survival. They gathered in Isolde's room, the three of them sitting around a small table while French evening light filtered through dusty windows. Isolde had acquired paper and pen from somewhere, already sketching out lists with the organized focus of someone used to creating order from chaos. We have limited funds, limited contacts, and every spy Blackwell employs will be searching for us. Her voice was clinical, detached. So we need a strategy that doesn't require resources we don't have. Caedric leaned forward, falling into the familiar rhythm of strategic planning despite the unfamiliar circumstances. The evidence is spreading in London. Newspapers are printing it. That means public pressure building on Blackwell and his allies. But we're not there to capitalize on it, Isolde countered. We're fugitives. Our testimony is worthless if we can't return to give it. Then we make sure the testimony doesn't need us. Evelyn's eyes had that sharp quality that meant she was seeing angles others missed. We write it down. Everything. Every detail of the conspiracy. Every name. Every crime. And we send it to every newspaper, every opposition politician, every reform advocate in Europe. Flood the market with truth, Caedric said slowly, understanding clicking into place. Make it impossible to suppress because it's everywhere simultaneously. Exactly. Evelyn's expression hardened with determination. Blackwell can hunt us across France. He can spend fortunes trying to silence us. But if the story is already in 1,000 hands, killing us accomplishes nothing. Isolde nodded, adding notes to her list. We'll need translation help. French, German, Italian newspapers. Contacts who can verify the evidence authenticity. I have contacts. Caedric's mind was already cataloging names, calculating who owed favors and who could be bought. Journalists, diplomats, business partners who hate Blackwell enough to act. And what happens after? Evelyn's question hung in the air like smoke. After the story spreads and Blackwell falls, and England possibly descends into political chaos, then we wait. Caedric spoke with the certainty of someone who'd spent decades planning long games. We wait for the scandal to settle, for new leadership to emerge, for someone in power to decide pardoning us is politically advantageous. That could take years. Probably will. And we just survive in exile until then? We build new lives. His voice softened. Maybe better ones. The weight of that possibility settled over all three of them. New lives. New identities. New purposes beyond the revenge and survival that had consumed them for months. It should have felt like defeat. Instead, sitting in that cramped room in a French boarding house, Caedric felt something uncomfortably close to peace. The empire was gone. The title was forfeit. Everything he'd spent decades building had crumbled in a single day. But the people who mattered were alive. The truth was spreading, and for the first time since his father's death had forced him to become something harder than human, Caedric had the opportunity to choose who he'd become next. Not the ruthless Duke, not the feared political predator, just a man trying to protect the people he loved while the world burned around them. The mathematics were brutal as always, but the variables had shifted, and maybe, just maybe, the equation had finally balanced towards something worth solving. Isolde cleared her throat, breaking the contemplative silence. There's one more thing we need to discuss. What? Serafina. Her voice was flat. She betrayed you completely, gave Blackwell everything. Nearly got us killed. Yes. And she's still in London, still free, still protected by the same system that's hunting us. Your point? Caedric already knew where this was going. My point is that she deserves to face consequences. Isolde's eyes were hard. And we're the only ones who can deliver them. You want revenge. I want justice. The words hung between them, loaded with implications that Caedric understood intimately. Because revenge and justice often looked identical from the outside. The only difference was whether you admitted what you were really after. He stood and moved to the window, staring out at Calais streets while his mind worked through the implications. Serafina had betrayed him completely, had orchestrated his downfall with Blackwell, had nearly gotten Evelyn and Isolde killed. By any measure, she deserved retribution. But pursuing that retribution meant resources, risk, and attention they couldn't afford. It meant letting anger drive strategy instead of survival. It meant becoming the man he'd been instead of the one he was trying to become. No. His voice was final. Isolde stood. She destroyed your empire. And I'm still alive. So are both of you. He turned to face her. Serafina won a battle. But the war isn't over. The evidence is spreading. Blackwell's conspiracy is unraveling. History will remember her as a footnote to a scandal that toppled ministers. That's not enough. It has to be. Caedric's voice hardened. Because chasing revenge means making ourselves targets, means exposing ourselves to Blackwell's hunters, means risking everything we just escaped for the satisfaction of hurting someone who's already irrelevant. She's not irrelevant to me, Isolde shot back. She helped kill my father. Your father is already dead. He met her eyes with brutal honesty. I'm sorry, but no amount of revenge will change that. All you can do is choose whether his death defines your future or whether you define it yourself. The silence was absolute. Then Isolde's composure cracked, and she started crying with the helpless rage of someone who'd carried too much loss for too long. Evelyn moved to hold her sister while Caedric stood by the window and hated himself for being right, because he understood exactly what Isolde was feeling. The need for retribution, the hunger for someone to hurt the way you'd been hurt, the mathematical certainty that revenge would somehow balance accounts that could never actually be balanced. He'd built an empire on those feelings. And look where it had gotten him. Exiled, hunted, stripped of everything except the two women crying in a French boarding house while empires crumbled across the channel. Maybe that was the real lesson. Maybe survival wasn't about being strong enough to destroy your enemies. Maybe it was about being strong enough to let them destroy themselves while you built something better from the wreckage. The thought should have felt like weakness. Instead, it felt like the first honest choice he'd made in years. Evelyn looked up at him from where she held her sister, her eyes red but determined. What do we do now? Caedric took a breath and made the decision that would define everything that came next. We start over. New names, new lives, new purpose. He moved back to the table and began writing on Isolde's paper. We coordinate the evidence distribution from here. We watch Blackwell's empire collapse from a distance. And we build something that doesn't require being monsters to survive. And if they come for us anyway, then we run again. His voice was steady. And we keep running until there's nowhere left to run or until England changes enough that we can finally stop. Isolde wiped her eyes. That's not much of a plan. It's the only plan that doesn't end with us dead or becoming exactly like the people we're fighting. He looked at both sisters. I spent 34 years being ruthless, being feared, being the kind of man who won every fight because losing wasn't an option. And it cost me everything human. His voice dropped. I won't make that mistake again, even if it means losing. Evelyn stood and crossed to him, her hand finding his with the same fierce certainty she'd shown since the beginning. Then we lose together, and we survive together. And maybe, someday, we win in a way that actually matters. Caedric pulled her close, feeling Isolde join the embrace a moment later, and realized something fundamental. Power had never made him invulnerable. It had just made him alone. But standing there in exile, hunted, stripped of title and fortune and empire, surrounded by the two people he'd chosen over everything else, he'd never felt less alone in his life. Outside, Calais descended into evening. Across the channel, England burned with scandal and political collapse. And somewhere in the ruins of what he'd been, Caedric Ashbourne found the courage to become someone new. Not a duke, not a predator. Just a man learning that the only power worth having was the kind you didn't have to fear losing. Because you'd already chosen something more valuable. 3 weeks in exile taught Caedric that survival was a different game than conquest. The boarding house in Calais became their war room, the cramped quarters transforming into something between fortress and prison as they coordinated the information campaign that was tearing through England like wildfire. Newspapers across Europe printed the evidence daily. Parliamentary investigations launched. Public protests erupted in London streets demanding Blackwell's resignation. The empire Caedric had sacrificed was being avenged by the truth he'd set loose. But truth moved slowly compared to hired killers. The first assassination attempt came on a Tuesday morning, disguised as a bread delivery that turned into 3 armed men kicking down their door. Caedric killed 2 with the pistol he'd acquired from French black market contacts. The third fled after Eveline put a kitchen knife through his shoulder with the kind of vicious precision that came from months of surviving predators. They moved locations that afternoon. The second attempt was subtler. Poison in the wine at a cafe where Isolde had been meeting a German journalist. She survived only because the journalist recognized the bitter almond smell and knocked the glass from her hand before she could drink. They stopped eating at public establishments. The third attempt nearly succeeded. A sniper positioned across from their new lodgings, patient enough to wait 3 days for a clean shot. The bullet missed Caedric's head by inches, shattering the window beside him and embedding in the wall where his brain would have been if he hadn't bent to retrieve a fallen paper. They stopped standing near windows. Each attack taught them the brutal mathematics of being hunted. Blackwell had unlimited resources and professional killers. They had improvisation, paranoia, and the desperate energy of people with nothing left to lose. The equation didn't favor long-term survival, but it did create opportunities for anyone reckless enough to take them. Caedric sat at the scarred wooden table in their current hideout, a warehouse basement near the docks that smelled like fish and desperation, studying maps of London while his mind calculated angles that kept narrowing toward a single conclusion. They couldn't run forever. Eventually, Blackwell's resources would outlast their luck. Eventually, a bullet would connect or poison would work, or they'd make a mistake that couldn't be survived. The only way to end this was to end Blackwell, permanently. Eveline appeared beside him, her presence announced by the familiar scent of cheap soap and the tension she carried like armor these days. You're planning something stupid, not stupid, necessary. Those aren't mutually exclusive. She sat across from him, her eyes tracking the maps with the sharp intelligence that had become even more pronounced during exile. You want to go back to London? Yes. To kill Blackwell. To finish what we started. That's suicide. Her voice was flat. Every spy, every soldier, every assassin he employs will be hunting you the moment you set foot in England. Probably. Then why? Because the alternative is dying slowly in French warehouses while he picks us off one by one. Caedric met her eyes with brutal honesty. We're losing this war, Eveline. The truth is spreading, but not fast enough. Blackwell's still protected by his allies, still has the Crown's implicit support, still commands resources we can't match. So your solution is direct confrontation? My solution is removing him from the equation before he removes us. He tapped the map. Parliamentary hearing scheduled for next week. Public testimony about the conspiracy. Blackwell will be there defending himself. Surrounded by guards, yes, but also surrounded by witnesses, journalists, the full apparatus of English law. You want to kill him in Parliament? Eveline's voice carried disbelief and something that might have been admiration. I want to expose him so thoroughly that killing him becomes unnecessary. Caedric's expression hardened. We have evidence. We have Isolde's testimony. But we need the final piece that makes conviction inevitable instead of just probable. What final piece? The financial records he keeps in his personal safe. The ones that prove beyond doubt that he orchestrated your father's execution and profited from treason. He pulled out a paper covered in notes. I know where he keeps them. I know the security protocols. And I know exactly how to get in and out before anyone realizes what happened. The silence stretched while Eveline processed implications. Then Isolde's voice came from the shadows where she'd been listening. You're insane. Possibly. Caedric didn't turn. But I'm also right. Isolde stepped into the lamplight, her face pale but determined. Even if you get those records, even if you expose everything, you'll be arrested the moment you appear in London, tried as a fugitive, probably executed regardless of what evidence you present. Yes. Then this isn't about winning, it's about revenge. No. Caedric's voice went cold. Revenge would be putting a bullet through Blackwell's skull and walking away. This is about ensuring that when I die, the truth survives. That your father's name is cleared. That the conspiracy is exposed so completely that even Blackwell's allies can't protect him. You're talking about martyrdom, Eveline said quietly. I'm talking about making my death matter more than my life did. He looked at both sisters with steady certainty. I spent 34 years building an empire on fear and leverage. I became exactly the kind of monster I needed to survive. But that empire is gone. That man is gone. All that's left is making sure the truth outlives me. The weight of that statement settled over the room like smoke from a funeral pyre. Eveline's hands trembled, but her voice remained steady. When do we leave? We don't. Caedric shook his head. I go alone. You and Isolde stay here where it's safer. Absolutely not. Her eyes flashed with familiar defiance. You're not sacrificing yourself while we hide in French warehouses, hoping your suicide mission succeeds. It's not suicide if it accomplishes the objective. It's suicide if you die regardless of success. Isolde moved to the table, studying the maps with tactical focus. But she's right. We're not letting you go alone. This isn't negotiable. You're right. It isn't. Eveline's voice went hard. You chose us over your empire. You killed for us. You gave up everything to protect us. And now you think we'll just let you die alone in some misguided attempt at redemption? I'm trying to keep you safe. We're already dead if Blackwell wins. Isolde cut through his protest with brutal logic. Every day we spend running is another day closer to a bullet we don't see coming. At least this way we control the timing. Caedric stared at both of them, seeing the reflection of his own desperation in their expressions. These women who'd survived impossible circumstances and still refused to surrender, who'd stood beside him through exile and assassination attempts and the slow erosion of hope, who somehow still believed fighting was better than hiding. The mathematics shifted. 3 people infiltrating London had worse odds than 1, but 3 people fighting together had something more valuable than good odds. They had purpose. And in Caedric's experience, purpose was the most dangerous weapon humans ever invented. Fine. His voice carried resignation and relief in equal measure. We do this together, but we do it my way. No improvisation, no heroics. We follow the plan exactly, or we don't go at all. Eveline smiled. When have I ever not followed your plans? Do you want a list? Fair point. Isolde was already making notes. We'll need forged papers to get back into England, contacts who can provide weapons, a safe house in London where we can stage before the operation. I have contacts. Caedric's mind was already cataloging names, calculating who could be trusted and who would sell them to Blackwell for the right price. But getting into Parliament will be the hardest part. Security will be extreme during the hearing. Then we don't go through security. Eveline pointed to a spot on the map. The old service tunnels beneath Westminster, built during the Civil War, mostly forgotten now. If they're still accessible. They are. I used them years ago for a different operation. Caedric allowed himself a grim smile. The question is whether they're monitored. Only one way to find out. The plan took shape over 3 days of intense preparation. Forged documents acquired through French criminal contacts who charged outrageous fees and asked no questions. Weapons purchased from a Belgian arms dealer who specialized in untraceable firearms. Intelligence gathered from London contacts about parliamentary security protocols and Blackwell's personal movements. Every detail checked and rechecked. Every contingency planned for. Every variable accounted for except the 1,000 unpredictable factors that turned perfect plans into perfect disasters. They left Calais on a fishing boat that stank of old catch and newer desperation. The Channel crossing took 6 hours through rough seas that left all of them green and shaking. The English coast appeared through morning fog like a ghost of everything Caedric had lost. He stood at the rail watching cliffs materialize from mist and felt the weight of return pressing against his chest. Coming back meant facing arrest warrants and execution orders. Coming back meant walking into the teeth of an enemy who controlled every advantage. Coming back meant probable death. But staying in exile meant dying slowly while Blackwell hunted them like animals. At least this way, they chose the terms of their end. The boat deposited them at a tiny fishing village north of Dover, where smugglers had operated for centuries. No customs, no officials, just a dockmaster who took their money and forgot their faces the moment they disappeared into morning shadows. London was 40 miles south. They stole a wagon from a farm at midday, leaving behind enough money to buy 3 replacements. Caedric drove while Eveline and Isolde huddled in the back under canvas that smelled like manure and old hay. The journey took 8 hours through countryside Caedric knew intimately from years of managing estates. Every mile brought them closer to the city where he'd built an empire and lost his humanity, where Parliament waited with its marble halls and political theater and the hearing that would either vindicate them or consume them completely. They reached London after sunset, entering through the eastern slums where guards were sparse and poverty made people incurious about strangers. The safe house was a rented room above a cobbler's shop in Whitechapel, arranged through contacts who valued gold more than loyalty to any particular crown. Inside, they prepared with the methodical focus of people who understood this might be their last night alive. Caedric cleaned his pistol, checking mechanisms that could mean the difference between survival and death. Beside him, Eveline sharpened a knife with rhythmic precision while Isolde reviewed maps and timing with obsessive detail. No one spoke about the odds. No one acknowledged the probability that tomorrow ended with all of them dead or imprisoned. They simply prepared with the grim efficiency of soldiers before battle. Finally, Eveline broke the silence. If this goes wrong, it won't. But if it does, she met his eyes. I need you to know something. What? Coming with you was the best decision I ever made. Even knowing how it ends. Even knowing we're probably going to die tomorrow. Her voice was steady. You gave me something worth fighting for. Something worth dying for. The truth? You. She smiled without humor. The truth is just what we're using as an excuse to destroy the people who hurt us. But you? You're the reason I'm not terrified of what comes next. Caedric set down the pistol and pulled her close, feeling her heart beating against his chest with the rapid rhythm of someone balanced between fear and determination. I was supposed to protect you. You did. Just not the way you planned. That seems to be my pattern lately. Isolde cleared her throat from across the room. As touching as this is, we should sleep. Tomorrow requires being sharp. She was right. They took turns keeping watch through the night, sleeping in shifts that never lasted long enough. Caedric's watch came at 3 a.m. when London was at its quietest and darkest. He sat by the window watching streets empty of everything except rats and desperation, and thought about the path that had led here. The empire he'd built from his father's ashes. The reputation he'd cultivated through ruthless efficiency. The years of treating people like chess pieces and power like the only thing worth having. All of it leading to this moment. Sitting in a Whitechapel slum preparing to infiltrate Parliament with 2 women he'd somehow decided were worth more than everything else combined. The mathematics should have been laughable. Instead, they felt like the first honest equation he'd solved in years. Dawn came too quickly. They dressed in stolen servants' clothing, the kind of anonymous uniforms that let people become invisible in the background of power. Caedric's pistol pressed against his spine beneath the coat. Eveline's knife sat strapped to her thigh. Isolde carried the forged documents that would get them past initial checkpoints. The parliamentary hearing was scheduled for 10 o'clock. They needed to be in position by 9, which meant entering the tunnels by 8, which meant leaving the safe house in 20 minutes. Caedric checked his pocket watch with mechanical precision while his heart beat steady and cold. Time to move. They walked through London streets like ghosts returning to haunt their own funeral. The city had changed in 3 weeks of absence. Newspapers plastered every corner with headlines about Blackwell's conspiracy. Protesters gathered in squares demanding justice. The scandal had metastasized beyond anything Caedric had anticipated. Good. Public pressure meant witnesses, meant accountability, meant Blackwell couldn't simply disappear them without consequences. The tunnel entrance was exactly where Caedric remembered, hidden beneath a condemned building near the Thames. The lock had rusted but yielded to Isolde's picks. They descended into darkness that smelled like centuries of accumulated filth. The passages were narrower than memory suggested, forcing them to move single file through water that came up to their ankles. Rats scattered ahead of their approach. Somewhere in the distance, water dripped with metronomic persistence. No guards, no patrols. Just forgotten infrastructure that the modern world had stopped maintaining. 30 minutes of navigating blind turns brought them to the access point beneath Westminster. Stone stairs leading up to a service corridor that connected to Parliament's basement levels. Caedric stopped at the base of the stairs and turned to face both women. Last chance to back out. Eveline's expression was pure determination, not a chance. Isolde simply checked her pistol. Let's finish this. They ascended into the heart of English power. The service corridor was empty, lit by gas lamps that cast shadows sharp enough to cut. Caedric led them through passages he'd memorized years ago during a different operation, each turn bringing them deeper into Westminster's labyrinthine interior. Voices echoed from somewhere above. Footsteps. The ambient sound of government preparing for another day of maintaining the illusion of order. They reached the level where Blackwell's private office was located just as bells chimed 9 o'clock. 1 hour until the hearing. 1 hour to retrieve the evidence and position themselves. 1 hour before everything either worked or collapsed into violence. Blackwell's office door was locked with mechanisms designed to prevent exactly what they were attempting. But Caedric had spent years studying security systems, learning their weaknesses the way other men learned languages. Isolde worked on the lock while he and Evelyn kept watch. 30 seconds. 40. The lock clicked open. Inside the office was exactly as Caedric remembered. Dark wood furniture, portraits of Blackwell's ancestors, the safe hidden behind a painting of some long-dead lord whose legacy probably involved similar corruption. Caedric crossed to the safe and began working the combination he'd learned through bribed servants months ago. The mechanism was old but well-maintained. Each number clicked into place with satisfying precision. The safe opened. Inside were ledgers, correspondence, financial records spanning decades, proof of war profiteering, evidence of bribes, documents connecting Blackwell directly to the conspiracy that had killed Evelyn's father, everything they needed. Caedric grabbed the most damning papers and stuffed them inside his coat. Then the office door opened, and Lord Chancellor Edmund Blackwell stepped inside, flanked by 4 armed guards. He smiled with the satisfied calm of a predator who'd been waiting for exactly this moment. Duke Ashbourne. How predictable of you to return. His voice carried amusement and contempt in equal measure. I've had this office watch since the moment you escaped. Knew eventually you'd come for these. He gestured to the papers in Caedric's coat. The guards raised their weapons. Caedric's hand moved toward his pistol but stopped when Blackwell shook his head. I wouldn't. You might kill one of my men, possibly 2, but the third will put a bullet through Miss Marrow's skull before you can blink. Evelyn stood frozen, a guard's rifle pressed against her temple. Isolde was similarly positioned, her earlier confidence replaced by cold calculation. Caedric's mind raced through scenarios, discarding them as quickly as they formed. 4 armed guards, 2 hostages, Blackwell positioned safely behind his men. No good options, no clever strategies. Just brutal mathematics that didn't favor survival. Drop the pistol, Blackwell ordered. Caedric complied slowly, letting the weapon clatter to the floor. And the papers? No. Blackwell's expression hardened. I'm not negotiating. Neither am I. Caedric's voice was steady despite the weapons aimed at his chest. You want these documents? Come take them. The room went absolutely silent. Then Blackwell laughed. You think you have leverage? You're surrounded, outgunned, moments from death. What possible... The documents are already copied. Caedric spoke with calm certainty. Every page, every ledger, every piece of evidence in this safe. I had them photographed weeks ago through contacts inside your household. Blackwell's smile faltered. Copies delivered to 20 different newspapers across Europe, scheduled to print tomorrow morning, regardless of what happens here. He met Blackwell's eyes with cold triumph. Kill me, and they publish. Arrest me, and they publish. The only way to stop this is to let me walk out of here and pray I'm feeling merciful. You're bluffing, am I? Then call it. Kill me right now and find out tomorrow when your entire conspiracy is front-page news from London to Berlin. The silence stretched. Blackwell's face cycled through emotions, rage, calculation, fear, before settling into something harder. Even if you're telling the truth, you still lose. You're a fugitive, a criminal. Your testimony is worthless. Those documents might embarrass me, but they won't destroy me. I have allies, protection, resources you can't imagine. Had. Caedric smiled. You had all of those things. Before the scandal, before public opinion turned, before your allies realized protecting you cost more than abandoning you. Lies. The hearing starts in 40 minutes. Let me walk into that chamber with these documents. Let me testify publicly. Let the world see you try to suppress evidence in front of witnesses. He stepped closer, ignoring the rifles tracking his movement. Or kill me now and become the monster everyone already suspects you are. Blackwell's hand trembled with barely controlled fury. The mathematics were shifting. Public execution would confirm guilt. Suppression would validate accusations. But letting Caedric testify meant gambling that parliamentary procedure could somehow contain the damage. No good options for Blackwell either. Just bad choices and worse ones. The Lord Chancellor's face twisted into something ugly and desperate. You think you've won? You think exposing me saves you? He laughed bitterly. You're a dead man walking, Ashbourne. Even if I fall, even if the conspiracy is exposed, you're still a fugitive who killed crown soldiers, still a traitor by law. Then I'll die knowing I took you with me. The words hung in the air like a death sentence waiting to be executed. Then Evelyn spoke, her voice cutting through the tension. Let him go. Blackwell turned to look at her. Why would I do that? Because I'll stay. Her eyes were steady despite the rifle against her skull. Let him testify. Let Isolde go with him as witness, and I'll surrender as collateral. No. Caedric's voice was sharp. Evelyn, it's the only play that makes sense. She met his gaze with fierce certainty. You need to be in that hearing. The documents need to be presented. Isolde needs to testify about what she witnessed. But Blackwell needs insurance that you won't simply flee afterward. This is insane. This is survival. Her voice softened. You taught me that. Power is about knowing what you're willing to sacrifice. I won't leave you. You won't leave me dead. She smiled without humor. But you'll leave me alive as long as I'm useful hostage, which gives you time to destroy him in that hearing. Time to turn public opinion so completely that killing me becomes politically impossible. The logic was sound. Terrible, but sound. Blackwell considered for a long moment, then nodded slowly. Done. Ashbourne testifies. Mrs. Isolde accompanies him. But Evelyn stays here, under guard. If either of you tries anything, she dies. If you flee after testifying, she dies. If those newspaper copies mysteriously disappear, she dies. Caedric's chest felt like it was being crushed. Every instinct screamed to fight, to refuse, to find some other way that didn't involve leaving Evelyn in Blackwell's custody. But Evelyn was right. This was the only move that kept everyone alive long enough to matter. He looked at her one last time, memorizing her face in case this was the last moment they had. I'll come back for you, I know. Her eyes held his with absolute trust. Now go destroy him. The guards separated them with brutal efficiency, dragging Evelyn toward a side door while Caedric and Isolde were escorted toward the parliamentary chambers under armed watch. The hearing chamber was already filling with lords, journalists, observers drawn by scandal like moths to flame. Caedric entered wearing stolen servants' clothes and carrying evidence worth more than empires. Every eye turned toward him, whispers erupted like wildfire. The fugitive Duke had returned, and he was about to burn down everyone who'd tried to bury the truth. The parliamentary chamber fell silent the moment Caedric stepped through the doors. Not the polite silence of men waiting for proceedings to begin. The absolute silence of predators recognizing another predator entering their territory, wounded and desperate, and therefore infinitely more dangerous than when he'd commanded respect through power alone. He walked down the center aisle with Isolde beside him and 4 guards flanking them both, his stolen servants' clothes contrasting sharply with the formal attire of lords and ministers who filled every seat. The stolen documents pressed against his chest beneath the coat like a heartbeat made of paper and ink. Every eye tracked his movement. Every face registered shock, calculation, fear. The fugitive Duke of Ashbourne had returned to the seat of English power, and he was carrying proof that could topple the government itself. Lord Chancellor Blackwell sat at the high table reserved for senior officials, his expression carefully neutral despite the rage Caedric knew was boiling beneath that aristocratic mask. Behind him, additional guards stood ready, hands resting on weapons with the casual readiness of men prepared for violence. Evelyn was somewhere in this building, held hostage against Caedric's compliance, a chess piece positioned to ensure he played the game exactly as Blackwell demanded. The thought should have terrified him. Instead, it sharpened his focus to a blade's edge, because fear was just another form of caring, and caring meant having something worth fighting for beyond mere survival. He'd spent 34 years building walls against that vulnerability, treating emotions like weaknesses to be eliminated. Now those walls were gone, and what remained was a man who'd finally learned that the only power worth having was the kind that came from knowing exactly what he'd die to protect. The Speaker of Parliament rose, his voice echoing across the chamber with ceremonial gravity. This emergency session is called to order. We are here to hear testimony regarding accusations of conspiracy, treason, and murder against Lord Chancellor Edmund Blackwell and associated members of this government. Murmurs rippled through the assembled lords. The speaker continued, his gaze fixed on Caedric with the careful neutrality of someone navigating political landmines. Duke Caedric Ashbourne, you stand accused of treason, murder of crown soldiers, and crimes against the state. Yet you have requested the opportunity to present evidence before this body. The Crown has granted this request on the condition that you submit to arrest immediately following your testimony. Understood. Caedric's voice carried across the chamber with the same command he'd once used to end careers and destroy rivals. I accept those terms. Then proceed. Caedric moved to the witness stand, a raised platform that positioned him above the assembled lords, like a man standing on his own gallows. Isolde took position beside the clerk who would record testimony. The documents felt heavy against his chest, tangible proof of crimes that men had killed to keep hidden. He began with his father's death, not the official story of a drunk who'd gambled away the family fortune. The real story. How his father had discovered corruption among suppliers to the military during the last war. How he'd been systematically destroyed by men who profited from that corruption. How a young Caedric had watched his father drink himself to death rather than face the humiliation of manufactured ruin. The chamber listened with the focused attention of predators scenting blood. Then Caedric shifted to Commander Marrow, a decorated naval officer who'd discovered the same corruption 2 decades later. Who'd collected evidence of weapons smuggling, profiteering from British and enemy deaths alike. Who'd been framed for treason and executed before he could expose the conspiracy. He pulled the first document from his coat. This is a letter from Lord Chancellor Blackwell to Minister Harrison, dated 3 weeks before Commander Marrow's arrest. It details their plan to fabricate evidence, bribe witnesses, and orchestrate a trial designed to end in execution. The chamber erupted. Blackwell rose, his voice cutting through the chaos. Those documents are forgeries, Ma. They're authenticated by 3 independent experts whose testimonies are attached. Caedric's voice was cold. I also have financial records proving you profited directly from the smuggling operations Commander Marrow was investigating. Transfers totaling over £2 million across accounts registered in false names. He produced more papers, each one landing like a hammer blow. Correspondence proving you coordinated with 6 other ministers to suppress evidence. Witness statements from soldiers who participated in the smuggling under your orders. Banking records connecting you to shell companies that sold weapons to both sides of the conflict. The mathematics were brutal and undeniable. Not speculation, not accusations. Hard evidence that couldn't be explained away through political maneuvering or aristocratic connections. Blackwell's face went white, then red, cycling through emotions too quickly to control. This is a persecution. This is justice. Caedric met his eyes across the chamber. You murdered innocent men to protect your fortune. You used the Crown's authority to commit treason. You hunted survivors across continents to silence the truth. He turned to face the assembled lords. I'm not here asking for mercy. I know I'm a fugitive. I know I killed soldiers during my escape. I accept that I'll hang for those crimes. But before I do, you're going to hear every detail of the conspiracy that killed Commander Marrow. You're going to see the evidence. And you're going to decide whether protecting Blackwell is worth sacrificing what's left of Parliament's credibility. The silence was absolute. Then Isolde stepped forward, her voice clear despite obvious terror. I witnessed the planning meeting. I was 16 years old, hiding in my father's study. I heard Lord Chancellor Blackwell and 6 ministers discuss how to frame my father for treason. I heard them laugh about it. Her testimony was devastating in its simplicity. No rhetoric, no emotional manipulation. Just flat recitation of facts delivered by a woman who'd spent 3 years in hiding because telling the truth meant death. When she finished, the chamber sat in stunned silence. The speaker cleared his throat, visibly shaken. Lord Chancellor Blackwell, you will have the opportunity to respond to these accusations. Blackwell stood, his composure cracking at the edges despite obvious effort to maintain control. These accusations are absurd, built on forged documents and the testimony of a girl who was a child when these events supposedly occurred. He gestured dismissively. Duke Ashbourne is a convicted fugitive with every reason to fabricate evidence. This entire proceeding is a farce designed to distract from his own crimes. The defense was weak, and everyone in the chamber knew it, because the evidence wasn't just documents anymore. It was public record. Newspaper articles spreading across Europe. Investigative reports from journalists who'd followed the money trails. Public protests demanding accountability. The conspiracy had metastasized beyond anything that could be suppressed through traditional channels. Caedric watched Blackwell crumble in real time, watched the Lord Chancellor realize that power built on secrets couldn't survive when those secrets became public knowledge. That fear only worked as control when people still believed you were untouchable, and Blackwell looked very touchable now. The Speaker called for a vote on immediate investigation and arrest pending trial. The result was overwhelming. 37 lords voted to arrest Blackwell immediately. 12 abstained. Only 6 voted against. The mathematics were final. Guards moved to take Blackwell into custody. The Lord Chancellor resisted, screaming about persecution and conspiracy and how this would destroy the government. No one listened, because the government had already started destroying itself the moment it protected traitors over truth. Caedric watched it happen with the detached calm of someone who'd achieved their objective at the cost of everything else. Blackwell was finished, the conspiracy exposed. Commander Marrow's name would be cleared. The truth would survive. Now came the price. Guards approached Caedric's position, handcuffs ready. The Speaker's voice was almost gentle. Duke Ashbourne, you are under arrest for crimes against the Crown. Your testimony will be considered during sentencing, but the law is clear. You killed soldiers during your escape. That crime demands justice. I understand. Caedric allowed himself to be shackled, the iron closing around his wrists with familiar weight. Where's Evelyn Marrow? Being held in secure custody. The Speaker paused. She'll be released now that your testimony is complete. Relief flooded through Caedric's chest like oxygen after drowning. She was alive. Safe. Free. Whatever happened to him next didn't matter as long as that remained true. They led him toward the chamber doors while journalists shouted questions and lords debated implications in rising voices. Isolde caught his eye as he passed, her expression carrying gratitude and grief in equal measure. He nodded once. She nodded back. Everything they'd fought for had been accomplished. Now came the reckoning for how they'd accomplished it. The holding cells beneath Parliament were cleaner than the tower but served the same purpose. Caedric sat on the narrow bench and waited while footsteps echoed in corridors above him. Time moved strangely in captivity, minutes stretching into hours that felt like days. Eventually, the cell door opened. Eveline stood there, flanked by guards, her face pale, but eyes blazing with relief and fury mixed so thoroughly they became indistinguishable. 5 minutes, the guard said. Then we're moving him to await trial. The door closed. They stared at each other for several heartbeats. Then Evelyn crossed the distance and kissed him with desperate intensity, pouring months of fear and anger and something terrifyingly close to love into the contact. Caedric responded with equal ferocity, his shackled hands awkward between them, but his focus absolute. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Evelyn's eyes were wet. You're an idiot. I know. You could have fled, could have taken the evidence and disappeared into Europe, could have lived and let Blackwell hunt you forever? He touched her face gently despite the chains. Not an option. So you chose martyrdom instead. I chose you. His voice was steady. Everything else was just logistics. She laughed through tears. That's the most romantic thing anyone's ever said while wearing prison shackles. I've always had terrible timing. The worst. They sat together on the narrow bench, Eveline tucked against his side despite the awkwardness of chains and limited space. What happens now? She asked quietly. Trial. Probably execution. The Crown can't let the killing of soldiers go unpunished even if the cause was just. There has to be another way. There isn't. He spoke with the finality of someone who'd already accepted what came next. I knew the price when I came back. I chose it anyway. For me. For the truth. For your father's memory. For the chance that maybe exposing Blackwell matters more than one more corrupt duke dying for his crimes. You're not corrupt. I was. For years. He looked at her steadily. I built an empire on fear and leverage. I destroyed people who opposed me. I became exactly the kind of monster that men like Blackwell create to justify their own cruelty. And then you changed. And then I met you, and realized that being a monster wasn't the only way to survive. That caring about someone was more powerful than controlling everyone. The silence stretched between them like a physical presence. Then Evelyn spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. I love you. 3 words Caedric had spent a lifetime avoiding, believing they represented weakness, vulnerability, the kind of emotional exposure that got people killed in a world designed to reward ruthlessness. He'd been wrong. Because hearing those words from this woman who'd survived impossible circumstances and still refused to surrender felt like the first honest thing anyone had ever said to him. I love you too. The admission came easier than he'd expected. Always terrible timing with us. Always. The guard knocked on the door. Time's up. Evelyn stood, wiping her eyes with sharp, angry movements. I'm not giving up. I'll find lawyers. I'll petition the crown. I'll make so much noise that they'll have to consider clemency. Evelyn, he caught her hand, don't sacrifice yourself trying to save me. Live. Build something good from this wreckage. Let that be how my story ends. Our story is an ending. It might be. He pulled her close one last time. But if it does, I need to know you'll be okay. She kissed him again, softer this time, carrying all the things they'd never have time to say. Then she left without looking back because looking back would have broken her completely. The trial lasted 3 days. Caedric sat in the dock while prosecutors detailed his crimes with clinical precision: escape from lawful custody, murder of 5 crown soldiers, conspiracy to obstruct justice. The charges were accurate and damning. His defense was simple. He admitted everything, explained the circumstances without trying to justify actions that couldn't be justified, stated clearly that he'd known the consequences when he chose to fight rather than surrender. The only thing he requested was that the record show why he'd fled, that Commander Marrow had been innocent, that Blackwell's conspiracy was real, that the soldiers he'd killed had been protecting a system that protected traitors. The jury deliberated for 4 hours, guilty on all charges. The judge's sentencing was immediate: death by hanging, to be carried out in 1 week. Caedric accepted the verdict with the same calm he'd brought to every other disaster in his life. The mathematics had always pointed toward this conclusion. All he'd done was delay the inevitable long enough to matter. They returned him to his cell to await execution. Time passed in strange rhythms. Days bled together. Visitors came, Isolde thanking him for clearing her father's name, Matthias maintaining perfect butler's composure while his eyes betrayed grief, various lords offering condolences that felt empty but sincere. Evelyn came every day. They sat together in silence mostly, her hand in his, both of them pretending this wasn't the countdown to his death. Sometimes they talked about nothing important, sometimes about everything. She told him about plans to use her inheritance to establish schools for officers' daughters, to create something good from the ruins of everything they'd lost. He told her about realizing too late that power was just sophisticated loneliness, that the empire he'd built had been a prison with better furniture, that meeting her had been the first time in decades he'd felt human instead of strategic. On the 6th day, she brought news. There's been a development, good or bad, complicated. She pulled out a letter with official seals. The crown is offering clemency, not a pardon, exile, permanent. You'd never be allowed to return to England. Your titles would be forfeit. Your properties seized. But you'd live. Caedric stared at the letter. Why? Public pressure. The newspapers have been running stories about the conspiracy non-stop. You're being portrayed as a flawed hero who exposed corruption at personal cost. Executing you would be politically complicated now. So I'm useful alive. You're useful not dead. Evelyn's voice was dry. Martyrdom apparently polls poorly with voters. The irony was exquisite. He'd spent his life building power through fear and leverage, treating every person as a piece to be positioned. Now the only thing keeping him alive was that the public had decided his death would look bad. The mathematics of survival had inverted completely. What do you want me to do? Evelyn asked quietly. Caedric looked at her, this woman who'd somehow survived everything he'd put her through and still looked at him like he was worth saving. The choice should have been simple: life versus death. Exile versus execution. Any rational person would choose survival. But Caedric had spent 6 months learning that rationality wasn't the only way to measure value, that some things mattered more than mere survival, that the version of himself who'd built empires on ruthless pragmatism had been missing the entire point. If I accept exile, I'll never see England again. I know. Never reclaim my titles or properties. I know. Never rebuild what I lost. She smiled sadly. And if you don't accept it, you'll be dead in 24 hours. So yes, you'll never rebuild your empire, but you'll be alive. We'll be alive, together. Isn't that worth more than titles? The question cut deeper than any accusation. Because she was right. The empire he'd built had been magnificent and terrible, and ultimately meaningless. Every title, every property, every victory had been steps toward an objective that didn't actually exist. The illusion that accumulating enough power would somehow fill the emptiness inside. It never had. The only time he'd felt whole was with her. In French boarding houses, in sewage-filled tunnels, in prison cells, where status meant nothing and only truth mattered. I accept the exile. Relief flooded Eveline's expression. Thank God. On one condition. He met her eyes steadily. You come with me. Not out of obligation, not because you think you have to, but because you want to build something new together. She laughed through tears. Where would we even go? Anywhere. Everywhere. He smiled for what felt like the first time in weeks. I hear Italy is beautiful this time of year. France too. Maybe we find some small town where no one knows who we were, and we figure out who we can become. That sounds terrifying. It sounds perfect. She kissed him then, deep and fierce, and tasting like salt and hope, and new beginnings built from old wreckage. The paperwork was finalized within hours. Permanent exile in exchange for his life. All titles, properties, and claims to English nobility forfeit. He would leave England within 48 hours and never return under penalty of immediate execution. Caedric signed without hesitation. They released him at dawn on a Tuesday morning under grey skies that matched London's perpetual mood. Matthias was waiting with a small bag containing the few possessions Caedric was permitted to take. Evelyn and Isolde stood beside a hired coach that would carry them to Dover and the boat beyond. No ceremony, no fanfare. Just a former duke walking out of prison into exile, while the city that had once feared him barely noticed. Matthias handed over the bag with quiet dignity. Your Grace. A pause. Caedric. The use of his first name instead of title carried more weight than any speech. Thank you. For everything. For 40 years of service. For saving our lives in ways I'll never fully understand. Matthias allowed himself the smallest smile. I served the position for decades, but I'm glad I got to serve the man before the end. They shook hands. Then Matthias turned and walked back into London without looking back. Caedric climbed into the coach beside Evelyn. Isolde sat across from them. Already absorbed in a book like this was just another journey instead of permanent exile from everything they'd known. The coach lurched into motion. London receded behind them through morning fog, the city disappearing like a dream or nightmare depending on perspective. Every mile brought them closer to Dover and the boat that would carry them across the channel into lives they'd have to invent from scratch. No titles, no empire, no power beyond what they could build through honest work instead of ruthless leverage. It should have terrified Caedric. Instead, watching the English countryside roll past while Evelyn's hand rested in his, he felt something uncomfortably close to peace. The empire was gone. The man who'd built it was gone too. What remained was someone new. Someone who'd learned the hardest lesson power could teach, that control was just fear by another name, and fear could never build anything worth keeping. They reached Dover by midday. The boat was small, nondescript, captained by a man who'd smuggled enough fugitives to recognize when silence was golden. The crossing took 4 hours through choppy waters that mirrored the turbulence they'd survived. Caedric stood at the rail watching England disappear into distance and felt the weight of 34 years sliding off his shoulders. No more political maneuvering. No more treating people like chess pieces. No more building walls against vulnerability because vulnerability was just another word for being human. Evelyn appeared beside him, her presence announced by familiar warmth despite the cold wind. Any regrets? About leaving? About everything. He considered the question with the honesty she deserved. I regret the years I spent being someone I hated. I regret the people I hurt building an empire that didn't matter. I regret not meeting you sooner. But not this? Not this. He looked at her steadily. Losing everything taught me what actually matters. You, truth. Building something worth protecting instead of just accumulating power to protect myself. That's very philosophical for a man who spent decades being ruthless. Maybe I finally grew up. At 34? Better late than never. She laughed and leaned against him, both of them watching France materialize from sea mist like a promise of new beginnings. What do we do now? She asked quietly. We find a place to live. Something small, somewhere quiet. He smiled. And we figure out how to be people instead of survivors. I don't know how to be anything else. Neither do I. That's why we'll figure it out together. The boat reached Calais as sunset painted the horizon in shades of gold and crimson. They disembarked onto French soil as different people than they'd been months earlier. No longer Duke and fugitive, just Caedric and Evelyn, two people who'd survived impossible circumstances and somehow found each other in the wreckage. Isolde insisted on continuing to Paris to pursue academic opportunities she'd discovered through correspondence with French universities. They said goodbye at the harbor with promises to write and visit once they were settled. Then it was just the two of them. They traveled south through France, moving slowly, stopping in towns that caught their interest. Eventually they found a village in Provence that felt right. Small enough for anonymity, large enough for opportunity. Beautiful enough to remind them that not everything in the world was brutal. They rented a cottage that needed repairs and spent weeks fixing it together. Caedric learned carpentry from a local craftsman who didn't care about his past. Evelyn started teaching English to children whose parents valued education over aristocratic credentials. The work was harder than commanding empires. It was also infinitely more satisfying, because building something with your hands, creating value through honest effort instead of leverage and fear, turned out to be the kind of power that actually meant something. Months passed, then a year. News from England arrived occasionally through letters from Isolde and newspapers that made their way south. Blackwell had been executed for treason. 6 ministers had resigned in disgrace. Parliament had launched reforms designed to prevent future conspiracies. The truth had survived long enough to matter. Commander Marrow's name was cleared posthumously, his service honored, his daughters recognized as victims rather than accomplices. The empire Caedric had sacrificed had been vindicated by the system he'd spent years manipulating. The irony wasn't lost on him, but it also didn't hurt the way he'd expected, because vindication turned out to matter less than building a life worth living in the aftermath. He stood on the cottage porch one evening watching sunset paint Provence in colors that reminded him why beauty existed. Evelyn appeared beside him carrying 2 glasses of wine they'd learned to appreciate through trial and error. Happy? The question was simple, but the answer was complicated. Because happiness wasn't something Caedric had pursued for most of his life. He'd pursued power, security, control. Anything that promised protection from the vulnerability he'd watched destroy his father. Now he had none of those things. No empire, no title, no control over anything except the small corner of France they'd claimed as home. And yet, yes, the admission came easier than expected. I'm happy, even without the power. Especially without the power. He looked at her steadily. Turns out controlling everything just meant being responsible for everything. This is better, building a quiet life in French countryside, building a life that doesn't require crushing people to maintain it. She smiled and leaned against him, both of them watching light fade into darkness, while crickets sang symphonies in the garden they'd planted together. Do you ever miss it? She asked. The empire. The fear. Being the Duke everyone was terrified of? Sometimes. Honesty required admitting that. But then I remember what it cost. What I became to maintain it. And I realize I don't miss the man I had to be to have those things. Who are you now? Still figuring that out. He smiled. But whoever he is, he's better than who I was. The silence stretched comfortable and easy. Then Evelyn spoke, her voice carrying something new. I'm pregnant. The words hung in this evening air like a revelation and a promise, and a terrifying responsibility, all compressed into 2 syllables. Caedric turned to look at her, searching her face for any sign of doubt or fear. He found only fierce determination and something that looked dangerously like joy. How long have you known? 2 weeks. I wanted to be sure before telling you. And you're terrified. She laughed, also excited. Also convinced we're going to be terrible at this. Probably. He pulled her close, feeling her heart beating against his chest with the same rhythm that had sustained him through everything. But we'll figure it out. Like we figured out everything else? Exactly like that. Through improvisation and desperation and refusing to surrender even when the odds are impossible. That's a terrible parenting philosophy. It's the only one we have. They stood together as night fell completely, crickets giving way to distant owls and the soft sounds of a village settling into sleep. Somewhere inside the cottage, their future was beginning. A child who'd never know the empire that had been sacrificed for truth, who'd grow up without titles or aristocratic burden, who'd learn that power came from building things rather than controlling people. The mathematics of it all were impossible. 2 exiles with nothing but each other, raising a child in a foreign country, building lives from scratch after losing everything. Any rational calculation suggested failure. But Caedric had spent a year learning that the most important things couldn't be calculated. That love and truth, and the stubborn refusal to become what the world demanded, those things operated on different mathematics entirely. Mathematics that somehow balanced even when nothing made sense. He thought about his father sometimes. The man who'd been destroyed by corrupt systems and chose drinking over fighting. Who'd given up because the cost of resistance seemed too high. Caedric understood that choice better now. Understood how easy it was to surrender when the enemy controlled everything and fighting meant losing everything. But he'd also learned something his father never had. That losing everything could be the beginning instead of the end if you were brave enough to build something new from the wreckage. The empire was gone. The Duke was dead. The ruthless predator who'd terrified London's political corridors had been replaced by a man learning carpentry in French countryside. And somehow, impossibly, that man was happier than the Duke had ever been. Because power built on fear was just a prison wearing a crown. But a life built on truth, on love, on the courage to be vulnerable with another human being, that was freedom worth any price. Even exile, even sacrifice, even becoming someone entirely new. Caedric Ashbourne had spent 34 years believing strength meant never surrendering, never compromising, never admitting weakness. He'd been wrong. Real strength was knowing when to let the empire burn so something better could grow in the ashes. Real power was choosing the people you loved over the control you'd spent a lifetime accumulating. Real victory was standing on a cottage porch in Provence with the woman you'd crossed oceans for, and realizing that everything you'd lost was worth less than what you'd found. The sun finished setting. Stars emerged. And in the darkness, two exiles who'd survived impossible odds stood together planning for a future they'd build together, one honest day at a time. No titles. No fear. No empire. Just love and truth and the stubborn refusal to let corruption win. It wasn't the ending Caedric had planned. It was infinitely better.